today's video, and it's been a little while since the last one, I appreciate, we'll be doing a much anticipated, by me if nobody else, masterclass on the Lord Veritant from the new Skaventide series. Now I put a post out on the YouTube community page a little while ago to say that this was coming, and the new plan for going forward is I'm going to try to paint a lot of the Skaventide box in masterclass format, so it covers pretty much every part of the painting process, so you can see everything from how I plan them out, how I prime stuff, to non-metallics, cloth, freehand, everything like that, just in one video, so you don't have to keep scrolling through all of them. Now this does make the videos quite long, and while I would like to shorten them all down, I find it easier if you just be able to see everything that is there. So this one is about 4 hours long, so it is a bit of a slog. To make life easier, I have broken them down into 14 chapters. In chapter 1, we'll look at silver non-metallics, chapter 2, gold non-metallics, 3, the cloak and some freehand, 4, chainmail and some minor details, chapter 5, the armour trim and again some small details around that, 6, the black cloth that I've used on the interior skirt thingy, whatever it is, chapter 7, the leather on all of the belts, chapter 8, the metallic trim and some other minor details, 9, the weapons, 10, some more gold was quite important on Stormcast, chapter 11, the purple gems on the hip plates, chapter 12, the head, so looking at how to do Caucasian skin, and chapter 13 we look at the weapons and some OSL, and 14 some final details, which is sped up a little, but that's just for ease. Anyway, let's get started. So as you can see here, we have the new Lord Veritant from the Skaventide box, possibly one of my favourite models from the box. I really do enjoy it, which is why I'm starting with it, other than the big one on the chicken. Now I primed it with Tamiya XF2 white with thin down with X28 thinner. And for some of the effects that we will be covering, this is very similar to a Citizen Sigmar Marshall that I was painting up to that point. Now, in terms of the finished effect, I kind of want it to have this level of polish, so similar levels of gold, some freehand, some nice contrasting colours, but also something that's not too difficult to replicate if you wanted to do it for an army. Now, in terms of the aspects like the sword, having a quite high metallic sheen to it works quite nicely, as well as having some reflections from fabric as well, adding those in. Some freehand around the edging of capes, which isn't as difficult as it sounds. Looking out to the face with getting some sort of focused expressions and some, I suppose, weathering, we might say, onto the skin, as well as an unhealthy dose of non-metallics as well. Oh, and this is also me showing off the cape that I've done, because I've not finished it yet and might not get around to it, given how many models are in the Skaventide box. But that should give you a general idea as to what the finished outline that we want to give. I believe by the time I've posted this video, the finished model will be available on my Instagram page, so if you want to see how it looks then, you will be able to see it there. Anyway, chapter 1, silver non-metallic metal. For this we'll be using something a little strange, and for this we'll be using Black Templar contrast paint and the Storm Shield varnish. Now you may think this is weird and that I've just picked up the wrong bottle, but I promise you I haven't. If you mix Storm Shield with a contrast paint, you can thin it down to the point where it comes a sort of slightly thicker and stickier glaze, which makes life much easier for using it. It also means you can build it up over a couple of layers, which I know defeats the purpose of contrast paints, but it does have a good effect. Now the reason why we're starting with contrast paints is because if you're very new to non-metallics, or this is your first time having a go at it, welcome. But if you're sort of perhaps not too sure as to where to put light levels or where to place your different highlights, contrast paints can be a good way of sort of cheating in this regard. And you'll see now that I'm starting with some of the metallic effects, and I've thinned it down to a glaze. As you can see on my thumbnail, it's very, very, very thin. If you want a trick for this, apply a little to the brush, put a dab of the paint onto your thumbnail, count to 3, and then wipe it off. If you can wipe it off with no trace, it's a good glaze. If there is a little bit of a trace, maybe thin it down a little more. If there's no trace at all and it comes off really easily, maybe add a bit more paint just to thicken it up. Now you can see here that I'm painting it on fairly loosely just onto the metallic areas that I want. I didn't really have a plan at this stage as to what I wanted to do, but all I'm doing is painting it on to give it a nice even coat to start covering over that white. Now the zenithal highlight does help with this in order to make sure that we keep our shadows going and that our highlights are in the right place. So this is the first sort of small cheat that you can do. But after you've applied about 3 or 4 coats, you will have an effect that looks like this. Now if you're very happy with tabletop level kind of things, or you like that kind of effect, you could leave it here. I won't be, but if you wanted to and you're doing things very quickly, that might be an option. Now you can see once we've done this that it does have a little bit of a shine to it in the metallic areas due to that varnish hitting, mixing with the contrast, and so where the light hits it, this more closely mimics where light would hit an actual metallic surface. And as you can see me waving my brush there, these are some general areas as to where I'm going to place some highlights. Now we start by adding some dark sea Ben from Pro Acryl to the mixture. Now my camera there is highlighting the Storm Shield pot. Don't know why it's doing that, maybe it enjoys it. But all we're doing is just adding a nice healthy dollop of it to that initial mix. Generally you can play this by eye. All we really want is a kind of slightly blackened mix of the dark sea Ben. It's already quite dark on its own, but adding a little bit of black just desaturates it a little more. And you can see I've got some other colours on my palette. That is from the Cavalier Marshall, so maybe I'll do a video on that later, I don't know. But anyway, to return to our Lord Veritant. Now I'm applying this just in a very general pattern, trying to either maximise the lines and the edges or to make sure that I've got everything sort of marked out where I want to go. Now on the breastplate I'm thinking that I'll have a rather central highlight from it to sort of follow the middle spike coming off the collar, and indeed to sort of look with the head, because obviously we're going to do some OSL from the flamey effect. May as well have a nice bright highlight in the middle to fade it out a little. So all I'm doing here, and apologies I just had to focus my camera, is applying that over the top of it in where I want the highlight to be. Now you can be quite general in where you place this, but generally what I have done is where the contrast is thinner, and you can see that just on the arm there, you can see some areas where it is a little thinner, it's not quite as dark, that's where you place your highlights. You can have some creative freedom into this as to where you're going to place them. If you don't want to follow that, you can make some adjustments, but if this is your first time, I highly encourage you to have a go at it. It does make life a little easier. This also goes for things like the hip plates, with being flat surfaces. Flat surfaces are quite difficult to do in non-metallics, because with a sphere or a cone, you know kind of where they're going to go, but with a flat surface, who knows? And really you can make it up. So that's what I did. And in this case, you can see that there is a little bit of darker material just in the kind of around the gem. And after I'd done that, we end up with this. Not too much of a difference, but that's where we got to. Now the next step, we'll push it a lot further when we add in some more light with bright warm grey. Now bright warm grey we're using rather than white in this case. I do switch to white later on just for ease of use and to show you how to get a slightly different effect, but I wanted some warmth in the armour because we're having a cold base coat, and by adding it in you can see we get this nice desaturated kind of bluey green kind of colour as it's appearing on camera. Now I'm only adding kind of one brush tip full, but you could add really as much as you like or as little if you want to build it up a bit slower. Anyway, here we are applying the highlights. Now I'm starting with the edges. For when you're highlighting non-metallic, it's best to start with your edges because otherwise you can forget, and or rather I can forget to do it. You might have a better memory than I do. But if you start with your edges, you therefore make sure that you've always got that built up. For this model as well, I would highly recommend using the side of the brush for the edge highlight rather than the tip, unless you've got really, really good brush control. I do make the odd mistake here that thankfully the camera hasn't picked up, but you may be able to notice them at the end. And as per usual, I'm dragging my brush towards the middle of the highlight and where I want the brightest point to be. That's because the paint will be deposited at the very end and where you lift the brush off. You can also build up small lines with it to look like brushed metal, and if you do this in a consistent sort of pattern, then you'll be able to have that effect built up as you do all of your highlights, and it will have a nice layered effect to it. Now with this highlight, all we do is just build up across all of the areas, trying to follow where we placed the Dark Sea Ben mix earlier, just on a slightly smaller area. This is what I would call the frame of the highlights in previous videos, but in this case it is just more a frame for a highlight and the first highlight itself. Now again, for the hip plates, they are a little tricky, so I am just making it up as I go along, but in this case I'm just vaguely following some of the areas where I can see the dark sea Ben and picking out around the general form of the shape. So any edges, make sure to highlight them. Any areas that you want to perhaps draw the eye to, you can highlight them as well. If you do have a large area of shadow, you can leave this if you want to, because having nice areas of shadow does enhance the metallic effect. I chose to just go for a bit over the top with the highlights here, so do add quite a few of them. This did turn out alright in the end. I'm still not entirely pleased with it now I've finished painting it, but they'll work, and let's face it, you're not really going to be looking at that, you're more going to be looking at the flamey weapons and stuff. That done, we are left with this. Now on the leg plate I have added some highlights to either side following the shape of the leg and indeed onto the foot. Now it's always best to have a line of shadow separating your highlights when you have non-metallics. If you're having trouble with this sort of area, just feel free to follow where I've put my highlights. Because of how bright it is at this point, it is struggling to focus, so apologies if the camera overlay does come off here and then. But with the shape of the arm, as you can see that I'm highlighting there, it follows in a cylinder shape. For the breastplate, it mainly follows with that main highlight into the middle. Now we add a little bit of white to the palette. I didn't get a video of me mixing it in, but I do wave my brush over the top. So it's a little bit of white with a little bit of the bright warm grey added to it, just to add some more brightness to it, but also desaturate it further. And once again, we start with the edge highlights, again getting it a little bit brighter, and you should be able to start seeing a slightly metallic effect here. If you can't, don't worry, it will come eventually, probably when you get to the very bright points. But I found with this recipe of using the bright warm grey, you tend to have that sort of oomph to the colours nice and early, so that you can start to feel quite confident in your metallics, rather than having to wait for the very end with the sparkly bits. Recorded this, the UK was going through a small heat wave, so I did have to keep reloading my brush and washing it because the paint was drying on the brush, and also my camera decides to go out of focus, which is very useful. Now that it's come back, you can see that all I'm doing is just building up a smaller area for the highlights, reinforcing those edge highlights, but again, bringing my brush across in small lines to build up that sort of brushed metal effect. And then I'll just do that on all of the other panels as well. If you want to experiment and have a go at some perhaps more interesting shapes or just more obscure shapes with this, feel free to. At this stage, you can glaze over the top of it and then it will just look like a secondary reflection or light bouncing off another metallic area. So don't be afraid of experimenting with it. If you do end up not liking where it is, you can glaze over the top of them with your base colour at the end. We do use contrast paints for this as well, but we will cover that towards the end because I do make a few mistakes here and there. If you want to have a secondary reflection, these will need to be a little bit darker than your main reflections to show that they are bouncing light, because if you imagine it kind of loses some of its potency as it bounces off something else. When this is the ground, another metallic piece, an enemy, the cloak, anything like that, it just needs to be a little bit dimmer. But for more information, consult a physicist, they'll probably know a bit more and be able to explain it better, I imagine. can see. While I do love the models, with them being push fit, it is a little restrictive as to where you can get your brush. But on the leg, again, just starting with a central edge highlight using the edge of the brush, doing that all the way onto the foot, so we've got a nice solid line between them, and then putting a circular highlight, or I think it's specular, maybe the word for it, I don't know. You can start to maximize that it is metallic because you've got that sort of bright, shiny point that goes over both sides into the shadow. Now, this makes it look metallic because it's kind of like a flare in there. You could do this if you wanted to with a different colour to try to make it look like it's reflecting off something nearby, and it's kind of like a glint kind of thing. But now that we've finished that, we do have a little bit shinier, and we can go even brighter. So we return to the wobbly palette, and for this I have just added some more white to the mix so that we get this, I think it's sort of like a duck egg colour, I suppose, but just so you're adding white to whatever your mix is, it should be fine. Not all metallics need to look completely identical. Mine may look different to yours, but that's okay. It's your world, you can do whatever you like, as Bob Ross used to say. And once again, we are starting with the edge highlights back where we started in the last one, maximizing them again and just trying to make sure that we are pushing the highlights as much as possible towards those edges. Now in this case, I'm not doing a full edge highlight to this, I'm only going into areas where the shadow would be. One general rule that you can use for non-metallics, again if you're just starting off, or if you're an experienced person, you may just want to have a refresher, or it might be just a new way, or I could be wrong and I'm making it up as I go along, but I've always thought that if you are painting non-metallics, it's always best to have a shadow facing a highlight and a highlight facing a shadow. So in the case of the breastplate, we've got those two darker areas of shadow around the edges, but then we can highlight the very edge of it to bring a highlight into it, and this just kind of shows the demarcation of it, so where light isn't hitting, where that is building up. And then for where it curves towards all those rivets, I just haven't painted them and left them entirely in shadow, and then I'm just doing a bright highlight of a line on the underside of it to make it look like light is bouncing off the ground and hitting that surface there. It does make things quite a lot quicker too. Now I'm using I think it was a size 00 for this. It could be a 0, but it looks like the 00. I recommend for when you get into your very brighter highlights to use a slightly smaller brush, predominantly because you'll have more control, but also because if you're using the same technique as I do, where I build up small lines over the surface in order to maximize that kind of brushed metal effect, having a smaller brush with a nice sharp tip means you can just make these lines even more precise, and you'll want them to be quite closely bunched together when you get to these bright highlights, because obviously the light will be hitting it, and having sort of ridges in it will make it look sort of corrugated, which we don't really want, which we also don't want my camera to focus apparently. There we go, it's back again. Now from a distance it is starting to look a bit more metallic. Now there is still more that we can do to it, and we will over the course of it, but you should be able to see by this point that it is looking vaguely metallic, and again you could stop at any of these points along there if you are happy with it. However, I will always encourage you to push it just a little bit further, because everybody has the ability to paint all of the stuff that's in this. I learnt how to do non-metallics in I think it was 2020 during the first lockdown here in the UK, and that's the first time that it had worked for me, and since then I've never really stopped doing it, as people who know me can tell you. That just sort of came of one rainy April afternoon, and that sort of sudden shake could do anything for you as well, or give it a go. Anyway, I'm rambling at this point. This is what it looks like when it is finished. You can see that we've got some brighter areas, some darker areas, but we could do a little bit more refining. Now here I am doing some refining with that by just glazing the base tone of the contrast paint Black Templar with some Storm Shield into it. Now I've added more Storm Shield to this because it thins it down into a nice glaze, and contrast paints make excellent glazes if you don't use the Storm Shield medium. Now it works with this because it is thin, but it also covers really nicely because of the contrast, the way that they are formulated. So you can glaze them really, really, really nicely and not need to do too many of them. Plus with adding in that varnish, you have a little bit more of a working time with them. And all I'm doing here is just running the brush over the edges between the highlights and the shadows in order to kind of darken them down again, because while I've made it quite bright, metallics work with lots of shadow too. what I will do is I will start glazing something at around this point, and then I may pause when I'm glazing and then come back to it at the very end to do what I call the sort of tidying up phase. For the video, I have tried to make sure that I do it all in one thing, but if you do get bored of glazing, don't worry, everybody does. All you have to do is just remember to come back to it later on. But the other good advantage of doing that is that if you think that you need glazing, it could just be the fact that your eye is overreacting to the zenithal highlight that you put on before. So you may think that something is too bright and it needs glazing down, but actually it's just because there is so much white around it, it's distorting your perspective of it. This can also happen if you're taking pictures to share online, so do be careful with that if you do see something that maybe does look perhaps a bit overblown or oversaturated, or overexposed for that matter, because certain cameras can do that. Just be wary of how much white you've got on there. Or if you're giving feedback to people, that can also be a habit. Also, when I was filming this, it was rather late at night because, again, as I said, we had a heat wave, and so you may see the odd moth or fly coming into my room. We do get a lot of them in the summer. I don't think any of them landed on the camera though, so it shouldn't suddenly be taken over by Mothra, but if it does, it probably made the video more interesting than it deserves to be. And with our glazing done, we can come back with some pure white on a very small brush and just start re-adding in our highlights. Once you've done some glazing, it's important to go back and just re-maximize your highlights, because if you've glazed over them too far, or indeed just if you've glazed anything at all, you may have just stained your highlights a little bit, and so reinforcing them just helps to maximize them again. I'm doing this with pure Schmincke titanium white. You can use any white that you have available. I just found a heavy body wasn't drying as quickly on my wet palette as some of the thinner ones on the night that I was painting, so decided to stick with that. And now we're just coming back in with yet more white and reinforcing all of the edges once again. Having multiple layers of this white can help, because with some white pigments you may find that they don't entirely cover in one go. And all I'm doing is just finding the middle point of all of the highlights and just going over, making sure that it is almost pure white, and you can see by that point that it is starting to look very metallic indeed, if I do say so myself. And when my arm is out of the way, we'll be able to see some more. I generally start when I'm painting with the main light source, which you can decide wherever you want yours to come from. You may wish to have one light source, two, well, as many as you like really, but your main one will predominantly be the sun. And as the sun is normally high above whichever model that you're painting, having your light source coming from above, or indeed above and slightly to the right or to the left, depending on what time of day you want it to be, it's useful just to go with that, and that can be a nice stable highlight point for you, and then you can add in auxiliary or tertiary highlights as you wish. Now I start with the main highlight because at least then I know that I have got that fully highlighted. I can then compare what I've got there with all of the other areas. So if I want to have it that perhaps they're stood in shade, or maybe that they've got something hanging over them, or I want a glow to be on it, as I do later on, I could limit the highlights on some of the other areas. With the hip plates, I do spend probably more time than I necessarily needed on these just to maximize it, because at this point they weren't looking quite right to me, and I think it was just from over glazing and then adding in some highlights, and I'd probably just spent a little bit too much and I needed to step away from it at that point. But I was in the middle of filming, so I didn't. You will probably also notice that when you're adding pure white, your shadows will immediately become darker, and indeed the entire area will. This is just the way that your eyes work. If you put something very bright next to something very dark, the dark stuff will look darker and the light stuff will look lighter. And here here I believe I am just highlighting the foot slightly off camera, but all I'm doing is just following the shape, starting with the edge highlights and tracing them around there. With the foot plates as well, you could, if you want to, and again this is just a real sort of bravery test to see how far you want to take it, but you can outline each of the panels as well by just doing a small line around each of them. In this case they would be rectangles. Doing some outlines and adding in some lines of your own to show the edges of the metallic plates really maximizes that metallic effect, because it looks like light shining down from the plate above with that band of shadow from underneath it that naturally forms upon the model from there. Again, only do this if you are very good with a brush, or you've got a really teeny tiny one, or you've got really steady hands, or just a really powerful magnifier. Or you want to show off, which is what I'm doing here. But we'll say it's for the purpose of education. Now the sword is getting a little bit in the way there, so you can't see the point that I was trying to make, but you hopefully will be able to see it at the end. When we get to the arm, it's very important just to be careful on this, because you do have some of the areas. I try to avoid getting paint onto the other sections that I'm painting when I'm sort of going around each area. This is just a habit that I picked up from watching a lot of Ben Comets' videos back when he did the old painting Buddha ones. And that's predominantly because if you do stain your zenithal highlight, it kind of ruins it in a way, because you don't have that pure white there. If you do, it's not the end of the world. You can just paint over it. But I do tend to try to just keep it as neat as possible. Plus then it means that I can take work in progress pictures a little easier. Now that it's all finished, we are left with this. Now you can see that it is looking very metallic, it is nice and sharp. I could probably do a little bit more glazing here and there, and indeed I do off camera, because otherwise it will bore you. But we are now moving on to chapter 2, we'll be covering some more metallic details with the gold. And we begin with the same process as we did on our silver, only this time using wildwood. A very dark contrast paint, but thinned down with some of the same storm shield as before. Now again we're using this as kind of an aid to non-metallics. It's a nice dark brown, which is very useful for non-metallic gold as a base. You can use other ones, I'm just using contrast paints because they're probably what people will have easily available. You could do the entire non-metallics with just contrast paints, and I have done that before. It's a little tricky to show on video though, because it's a lot of going back and forth, highlighting, re-highlighting, adding white in, glazing, so it's a bit monotonous, but if you want to see it, I will attempt to record something for it. It might be a bit sped up here and there. But as you can see here, I am adding just a nice strong layer of the wildwood over the gold metallic areas, and showing you my arm quite a lot. As we did before, we're just applying layer after layer until we get a nice solid foundation to work from. Now at this stage I don't paint all of the gold pieces at this point of the video. I do save some for later, because they are either areas that I just wasn't entirely sure whether I wanted them to be gold yet and I didn't want to ruin the zenithal, or I just mainly thought, well, I'll get these done to test to see whether they work. Because you can, at this stage, if you want to, just slow down and do some specific areas to test to see whether the colours balance, or whether they sort of match up here and there. In this case they did, but there have been cases before. Oh, you can see that I made a mistake there. If you do get contrast paint anywhere where you don't necessarily want it to be, all you have to do, clean your brush and then wipe it off. Because we're using contrast paints, you can remove them very, very easily from other areas. And if you do get a little bit of staining, all you have to do is glaze over the top of it with the colour that was there before. If it goes onto your highlight, use some of your highlight colour. If it goes over your shadow, just darken it down. Or if you really can't get it off, disguise it as weathering. as I put the final brushstrokes on, we can do a snap cut to what it looks like when it's done. Now notice I haven't painted the collar with either the silver or the gold, and that's because I leave it generally to the end because I didn't really know what I was going to do with it at this point. I also was a bit scared of getting paint onto the head, so I didn't know what to do. But we're going to start with some paints from Pro Acryl. These are new from the Flamion set. They are amazing and I love them. Do go out and buy them. I'm not sponsored, I wish I was. We'll be starting with a base of dark green brown and going up to a final highlight of bright yellow green with caramel brown and bright yellow ochre in the middle. We'll also keep wildwood on hand just in case we need to do any glazing. Now we start with a base coat of the dark green brown. It's really, really, really nice as a base. You can add a little bit of black to it if it is a bit too bright. I've just been using it pure out of the pot, with a little bit of water to thin it down, and getting some fantastic results from it. It's really simple to use. It covers really, really nicely. I could go on, but then probably YouTube would say this is an advert rather than a tutorial. Now, all I'm doing is applying it onto pretty much all of the areas other than the deepest recesses where the contrast paint has soaked into it. Unlike with the silver, we don't have to make too many creative leaps as to where we want our highlights here, because ultimately we're using the wildwood to show where our deepest shadows are going to go. So at this stage we don't have to be too creative. Later on we probably do, but because we've started with the silver, we can use that as a guide as well. Now I'm trying to be very, very careful with the brush at this stage. I do get a tiny amount of this base coat onto that highlight on the leg. If you do that, you can wash it off as you did before if you're quick enough, or if, because of the way metallics work, if you want to leave it there, it can look, if you highlight it later on, it can look like just a natural reflection from where the gold will have shone onto the silver, so you're maximising some of the effect there. Personally, I'd say it's probably a little bit easier to just wipe it off and try to do it and then paint over the top, but if you really do get stuck and you don't want to sort of ruin something that you think you might have painted perfectly, you can try it this way. And hopefully from here you can see just how well the paints do cover even in one coat. Once that's all done, we have something like this. Hopefully you can see that it does cover really nicely and that we've got that little element of shadow there from the wildwood covered over nicely by the dark green brown. Some areas have not been perhaps too neat, and that's intentional. I'll glaze over it later. Now we use bright pale yellow. Now this is a slightly different way to how I would normally do non-metallics, but I believe from looking at some of his work that this is the way that Flamion himself does paint, so I thought I would give it a go. I'm not entirely sold that I like this way of painting. It gives you an amazing effect, but I'm just not very good at it. But as you'll see from the end of it, it does sort of add a few more steps to go around. But by using the bright pale yellow, we can start to add our brightest points. It's kind of like sketching like we did on the Spiro Mirabilis bust that we were working on a little while ago. And we are just building up all of the brightest points on the edges and where we want them to go. Now, as I said before, you can use the other areas of metal that you have painted already as a guide for where you're going to place your highlights. So with the leg, that's where we're starting here, we have that central specular highlight in the middle and then the highlights either side of that. On the knee pad, because this would always be hit by the same light source, you can just follow where you've put those highlights before onto the leg and translate them over to where they would go on the knee pad. the breastplate and the collar, the hip plates and the shoulder pad, and indeed the, I suppose the other bits of the breastplate as well, the trim things. They probably have a name, but I don't know what it is. Now from a distance, this is starting to look really quite gold, and if you squint and turn your head, it could work quite nicely, but if I zoom in, you can see that it is a bit, perhaps not polished is the right word. If you want to stop at this and you want to go for that kind of quick, and you're going to go for maybe some oil washes, or you want to go for a kind of grimdark kind of look, this would be quite a good place to stop, because I imagine you could probably get a good effect by washing over it and adding some grime and stuff to make it look a bit beaten. I'm going for a more polished one, just because I enjoy it, but if that is the style you want to go for, power on. And if you are struggling with where to put your highlights, feel free to just follow precisely where I have put mine. I would encourage you that if you are following the video and you do just copy where I put my highlights, do have a go at trying it yourself without them, but if you are stuck, do not worry. Feel free to copy me. I won't tell you off for doing so. In fact, I'll probably be quite honoured that you are copying mine in the first place. Now, the sphere that is on the calf muscle, is it? Whatever it is, you can do this by adding a very bright highlight just at the top, and then doing a line highlight from the bottom to show where light is hitting the bottom of it and shining up. Now again, this does look quite gold, and really that's probably the bit that I've thought came out the best at around this point. All of the others, they started to look a bit too bright, but I can see the benefits of doing this style of non-metallics. I don't think I'll continue it unless I'm sort of doing some sketching and I know that I'm going to be highlighting. It might work very well on larger miniatures, or if you're Flameon, because he appears to be a master of this kind of thing. And with all of that done, you can see that this is the result. As I said, if you squint, it does look golden. You could stop there, but we can add some mid-tones with caramel brown. Now, in the set from Flameon, there is orange brown as well. That, I think, is for the warmer tones. Caramel brown is for the colder ones. And I kind of want this to be a nice cold gold to fit with the story that I've got going for it. And I'll tell you about that once I've gone over the technical stuff. Now, for the caramel brown, what we're doing is just painting it over the transition between the highlight and the base tone. This does help to smooth it out and can speed up this process. So again, as I said before, I can see the benefits of doing it this way. It's just probably not for me. I'm also not very good at it, so that may be the other reason. But we're painting this over to kind of blend the base tone and the highlights together. It's a little bit dark, so we do add another tone into the middle to make it look more gold. But with this, we're just painting it over onto the thing. Don't be afraid of going too far. You can always reapply your maximum highlights afterwards. But to tell you the story as to what I want to go for. Now, I've been reading the core book of Skaventide, and there's some really nice lore updates in there. I shan't spoil them for you in case you're still planning on reading it, but one of the things that they've brought in are these thing called the bleak holes, that are these, I suppose, strongholds where the ruination chamber lived. They may have been in there before and I just didn't notice, but if they were in there, they still sound like a nice fun idea. But they're where the Stormcast that have kind of forgotten that they were ever human, and they're starting to become more storm than man, are held. I think Vander's Hammerhand of first edition fame is currently being kept in one. Now, for many of these people, Stormcast rather, they are a bit grimmer, they don't really respond as people, they're almost automatons. And from reading some of them, it gave me the idea of how we could make them look a bit more gothic, and leaning into that idea of them being perhaps a bit more associated with death and be a bit more grim and stuff like that. Not necessarily in a grim, dark Blanchitsu way, but from reading around on that, they have started having it where you have Stormcast that are not entirely, I suppose they don't worship Sigmar as much, and that is accepted within the Pantheon apparently, but instead they have chosen to dedicate their work to Morda, the newer version of Moor from, if you play Total War Warhammer, you'll know that Elspeth von Draken uses the Gardens of Moor. Now, looking at the art for Elspeth von Draken, I took quite a lot of inspiration from that. Originally I was even going to put some roses all over various of the fabric that was there, but decided not to because roses are really difficult to paint. So I may do them eventually if you want to see them, but just for this one I decided to go for something different, which you shall see in the next chapter. But because we are looking at mortar for this scheme, I decided having a colder gold would contrast the more conquering heroes kind of look that the first and second edition Stormcast were given. Now, in second edition, when they were facing the Nighthaunt, they were a little bit more desaturated, but they still had that they're very bright, and you could tell that they were heroic. These ones I want to get the whole idea that people are off-put by a lot of the Stormcast. And there's even a bit in, I think it was a free PDF that the community site put out that was on Hell's Claw, I think it was, where they even have it where some of the Ruination Chamber, they even sort of worry some of the Stormcast. And so I wanted to lean into that a little bit more and to show that they are the, not so much the anathema of Stormcast, but they're just something that they're not entirely trusted. Particularly with the Lord Veritant, as well as they are a more inquisitorial kind of Stormcast, again adding in that level of kind of grim, gothic-y nature to it. Now that the caramel brown has dried and it has 2 coats of it, you can see it is starting to look a bit more blended, but we need to go a little bit brighter, and so for this we use bright yellow ochre. Now this is a much yellower colour that we can add into it, so it will maximise it to look gold, and this is the one sort of warmer tone that we're using in this, simply to really reinforce that this is gold that we're looking at and it's not a sort of a brassy kind of tone. And all I'm doing is just applying this between the transition of the caramel brown and the bright pale yellow. This is placed in exactly the same sort of way as before. All we're doing is just painting it onto that transition, and you will be able to see immediately just how this does sort of work to make it look gold. It's not, I suppose, a good way of doing it. It seems realistic at that stage, and you can apply this as much as you like, and then once we have finished this one, we will be glazing over it a lot. And just to have a small spoiler, I did spend, I think, 2 days as well glazing around these, because I really wasn't happy with the finish that I got after this step. I could see that it did look gold, but it just, on camera, it didn't look entirely right. Watching the footage back as I'm recording the voiceover, it does, I suppose, look alright. I was probably being a bit too precious with it, but there was just something about it that didn't quite sit well with me. And I think it is just because I started with the brighter points and I prefer to build it up slowly over the layers. But that's just me. You may really like this method of doing it, and I encourage you to try both. As if by magic, the camera focuses and it is done. I still wasn't too pleased with this at this point, and one thing that I did learn from looking at a lot of Flamion's work is that while the paints are excellent on their own, you can darken them a little, and in the past I've used things like Rhinox Hide, but in this case I didn't really want to add that warmth, so I instead chose to just glaze in some pure black. Now for this I'm using Coal Black from Monument Hobbies, but you could really use any of them. Now I thinned it down to the point where you can barely see it when I rub it onto my thumbnail there, but all I'm doing is just applying it into those recesses in the shadows, and just not being too precious as to where I'm putting my brush. I'm allowing it to wash over it, because this desaturates the gold and makes it look, I suppose, a bit more metallic, I suppose you could say, but it also just reinforces all of those shadows that have been lost somewhat in the highlighting process. This also does help to blend some of it together. You can see that with the teeth and the ornamentation on the sort of the wolf's head kind of one, it needed a bit more definition there. It wasn't looking too gold. It looked a bit of a mess. It still does in many ways. I just couldn't be bothered to go back and repaint it. cut forward a few days and we are left with this. It was really a few days. I think I spent 2 full days just glazing over and polishing all of the metals, the silver as well. This was mainly because as the more that I was doing it, I realised that there were some imperfections, but I was happier with it now than I was when I left it, and I think it is just from glazing the base tones back onto it and indeed from maximising the highlights. Now you can see me waving my brush there with some of the areas that I want the glow to go from the weapons, which is why I've not fully glazed them entirely at this point or covered all of the metallic areas, just because at this point I was still planning where to go. But on the next step, we will have a look at the cloak. Now I had a little trouble coming up with the colour for the cloak. I wanted to use Vallejo Crimson from Nocturna, but they don't make it anymore. I then decided maybe trying to use Alizarin Crimson from Chimera. This looked alright, but it left a load of pigment in the recesses of my test model, so I decided, nope, not using that, can't be trusted. I then thought maybe about using Burgundy or Burnt Sienna, just something like that, but again, they didn't really look quite right. I then thought maybe Dark Purple, but this was a bit too blue for what I wanted and it didn't really work. I then thought, well, maybe Burgundy on its own, that might work. That didn't really work either. I then thought, well, maybe I could do it with a bright red and do Red Oxide. It's a nice tone, but it doesn't work. But then I ended up with Dark Plum from the Ninjon series, and it's quickly becoming possibly my favourite colour. And we start with a thinned application of it. I've thinned it down perhaps a little more than usual. This is mainly because it makes it easier to wipe off if I do get it on any areas that it shouldn't be. But all you have to do is just paint it onto all of the areas that you want this, on all of the areas of the cloak. You won't be able to get your brush into all of the areas if you've assembled the model, but once you've got a nice solid base coat, I think this took 3 layers overall, you will be left with this. Now because we've used a thin application of the paint, we can still see some of that zenithal shining through, and this will help for us to put our highlights. And you see that I did try to get most of it there, but because I'd primed it black, then it did help to cover over some of the areas just to make them look like they're in shadow. Now for some of the areas I do want there to be a glow, so I don't highlight them fully, or I don't really highlight them at all until the very end, because I'm going to have the glow from the weapons. At this point I didn't know what colour I was going to do the glow, otherwise I probably could have painted it in at this stage before I did the other sections, but that's just kind of more of the fun of it. You don't have to have it all planned out when you're painting, and it did more develop as a story at that point. But at this stage, I'm just waving the model around in order to show you where I want the highlights to go. And we're highlighting this very simply with the very complicated mix of taking some dark plum and adding some white to it. And that is all. You'll also see I have switched palettes at this point. I do have a couple of wet palettes that I keep on hand. I find this easier when I'm filming. One is is the Red Grass Extra Large version 2 palette, whatever it's called, the big blue one basically, and this one is a Army Painter War Painter edition, the one where you get the little dry palette with it as well. Now all I'm doing is applying it onto the raised areas, the folds of the cape, or anywhere where light would hit it, sort of anywhere that is perpendicular to our light source, so in this case the sun. Now I'm starting with this corner because it's got a lot of nice raised areas, but you could really start anywhere as you wish. When you get these sort of more shallower curves, remember to draw your brush towards the top of them, because ultimately that is where the light will hit them. You don't have to go all the way if in this case there is things like the shoulder pad. It is almost off camera there, hopefully you'll be able to see it. Sorry for that, I didn't check the recording when I was doing it. But if you draw your brush upwards, you get more pigment there, but it also does start to blend it if you have thinned the paint there. This is kind of like if you ever watch any Bob Ross. I do keep bringing him up, I realise, but when he's doing mountains he likes to marble the paint that's coming off the brush. This is a very similar effect where you're allowing the brush to kind of like to run out as you're going along. Now for this large highlight that I'm putting onto this sort of large billowing area of the cape, I've thinned the paint down perhaps a little more than you would normally expect to. It's kind of like a thick glaze, and I'm pulling the paint towards the middle of it, going from either side, so I basically cover the entire area in it. Now the reason for this is because we want to build up that colour nice and smoothly, because it is a nice smooth curve. I then wash the brush very quickly and run it over the transition between the base tone and this highlight. This is called feathering. I'm very bad at feathering, so I don't use it that often, but in this case I thought that it was probably something to try out. As you can see, I've not been quick enough on the other side, but thankfully it doesn't really need it, and I will be glazing over it anyway. And then we just return to some of the other areas. I'm taking a big leap here and just sort of painting in a fold onto the edge of the cape. You'll be able to see it later on, but all this was doing is just following where my painting light hit it as I was painting it. This again helps from using the Tamiya, whichever code it is for the paints. It helps to shine through, and it does sort of maximize it, but if you paint over the top of it, you still will be able to see through it, so you can use that as a rough guide, if again you are struggling with it. Alternatively, just follow where I'm painting, where these are. Now again, I'm dragging my brush to where I want the brightest point to be, but I'm also just doing these small lines with it to build up a faint amount of texture. Now I want this to be a fairly, I suppose, well-maintained cape. It's got the odd tear into the bottom, but I wanted it to look like it has been given a sort of, like, it is taken care of, in that while this Stormcast may be losing some aspect of their humanity, they're still taking care of their war gear. And here you can see me just edge highlighting and really reinforcing those highlights there. And now we can return to that large billowing edge, starting at the middle and trying to make sure that the paint is firmly there, like we did with the non-metallics. I'm just building it up again on a slightly smaller area with the same paint, but because we're using a thinner paint, we can actually use the a different opacity between the layers in order to help blend it even as it is drying. And from a distance, we can see that it is starting to have the effect that we want. Once that is done, we are left with this. Now again, I haven't necessarily highlighted the side with the sword on, but I have gone on and added some sharper highlights just on the other side because it's got a lot of those sort of sharp lines mixed onto it. It's probably the easiest place to start. but because you've got all of that other detail into there, you just have to be a little careful with what you're doing. But if you're happy with the cape, you could leave it here. I wanted to push it a little bit further. So we return to the palette and we are just adding some more white into our previous mix. I've given it a fairly decent gobbet of white there until it becomes a fairly nice pink. And just adding a little bit of water there because it was another hot day, so the paint was drying a little quicker than I liked. But having a thinner paint is never a bad thing. It just means that you can apply your layers smoother. You just need to be a little bit wary of how runny it is, because if you get it too runny, you have a little bit less control, but it's not the end of the world if it is. You just have to do a little bit more glazing or tidying up afterwards. Now, as soon as past me brings the model back, oh, there we go, we'll hold it off camera, but all we're doing here is just the same thing as we did on the previous step, where we're reinforcing that middle light there. You can just see it placed there, and hopefully I will show you on camera in a second. But we're reinforcing that highlight point into the middle in exactly the same way as we did before, just with this brighter paint. Now, there may be a more easily noticeable line between those two layers. You can quite clearly see it there as it's drying, or you would be able to. Here I am just trying to feather it again. Don't think I was quick enough in this case either. Probably best that it's off camera then, so you can't see that I've done that wrong. Now, as it's drying, you can see it's very patchy and it does look like a bit of a mess. And you may think that it is a mess. In fact, I might be inclined to agree with you. But we will come back to that later and just reinforce it. For now, we are just going to go over all of the areas that we've done before and just add some brighter points to those. Some of these will be done by the time we have just applied this layer to them, because they don't need to be up to maximum opacity. We don't even need to go up to pure white in this case. And now that we're back on camera, you can see all I've done is just reapply another layer there. This had to stop it looking patchy. It still doesn't look quite right, but it's less, has got less coffee staining as it did before. If you happen to get some, don't worry, we do tidy it up later on. But if you can avoid it earlier on, it does make life a little easier. But this will, sometimes it's just unavoidable. Could be that it's sort of quite dry where you're painting, could be quite warm, might be just that you maybe thin the paint a little too much, but again, nothing wrong with that, as I said before. Everything is fixable, it's just paint, and you can always paint over it. Now for this corner of the cape, I am applying highlights similarly to how I do non-metallics, where I'm adding a band of highlight into the middle. This can work if you want something to look sort of satiny or like a very, or sort of like silk, I suppose. I find that if you have multiple, attempt multiple textures throughout the cape, it eventually all sort of blends into one, so you can have many different textures onto it, but it just reinforces that it is fabric rather than something else. So by having the sort of scratchy effect as I'm doing onto that corner, it can look like a weathered section on the top, where perhaps they wouldn't have got too many scratches onto it, probably because they've been defending. Not that they seem to be using that shield much, but hey, it's just a little more polished. And here you can see that I'm just reapplying another layer on top. Now with a slightly thicker paint. Again, I think this was possibly too thick at the time and I didn't notice, but looking back I could probably have done this with a slightly thinner layer. I'm just adding that final sort of like opaque punch towards that middle highlight and going over the edge as well. Now while this is wet, it does look perhaps a lot more polished, let's say, than it did before. When it dries, it kind of loses something to that effect, but that's all right. For now, I'm just using the side of the brush and dragging it towards this main highlight in order to kind of blend it with the brush as we're going along, and just to give myself a guide for when I come to glaze, so that I know that I've got that highlight there, I can glaze over that section, but I've also got the limit for where I need to go. And sharp cut later on, we have got those finished. We've added a little bit more white into our mix, and we're just adding some more lines to it. Now, for some reason, my camera did decide to start sort of making everything really bright. I think it's because I was recording during the day, because it had cooled down a bit. So there are some sharp cuts here and there. I've tried to keep the footage as consistent as possible, but there are just a few sudden jumps. So if it does suddenly look like stuff has been cut out, it probably has, but I've tried to make sure that you don't miss anything. In this case, just with some thinned paint, I'm glazing towards the middle of that highlight in order to just make sure that I've bumped up all of the opaqueness of it. From certain angles it doesn't look particularly highlighted, but in others it does. Now, I've been through and just added another layer onto some of the areas where I hadn't before, and so you can see from certain angles it is now starting to look nice and shiny. But with this main highlight, it is the thing that your eye is drawn to, and it's a bit of a bother because it doesn't look right. So we're going to do some more glazing. At this point I thought the front was fairly well balanced, and it does work with it, but we're going to glaze with some pure dark plum anyway. I find it best to glaze with non-mixes, because then you know that you've got the same tone as what you start with. If you do need to mix stuff in to glaze with it, it's not impossible, and it still can be done. I just find that having that as almost like a save state, I suppose, to go back to, because then you know that you've got all of the same pigmentation as you started with. But we are glazing towards our shadows here by dragging the brush from the highlight towards them. Now, holding the model here was a bit of a pain because the fire is quite sharp, but all I'm doing is just dragging it from the highlight in order to shade over it. Very similar to what we did with the Armour. If you're new to glazing, or you're new to doing any of this, do try to have a go at glazing. It is really useful, it can help fix a lot of your mistakes, and it's very therapeutic, because all you're doing is just moving nice thin paint around. Can take a little while though, so maybe put on a podcast or something. Now, with just one very, well, I suppose two thin glazes, you can already see that that is starting to look already a bit more blended, which you could do this with an airbrush too. If you have an airbrush, feel free to have a go with it. I do have one, I'm just not very good with it, so I do choose to do it. I also don't like airbrushing on camera, just so I don't get any particulates hitting my camera lens. Although it is off camera here, all I'm doing again is just looking at areas where I can see the transition between the base tone and my highlights, and just dragging the brush over them, applying this thin glaze from one side to the other. You can do this as much or as little as you desire. It's entirely down to you. It's your model, it's your world. You can do what you like. Which, speaking of, you don't even have to do the cape purple. If you don't want to. This again is my way of doing it. If you don't like it, you don't have to copy it. Hopefully you can just take the techniques that I'm showing off here and apply it to your own colour scheme. Or if you do like the colour scheme that I've chosen, feel free to add more to the Legions of Mordor, as I've decided to call them. For some of the modelled on creases, you can be using the very tip of the brush, provided you've got a very steady hand, as I don't appear to here, you can just add a tiny dab of that glaze into the recesses to really maximise the shadows there, and it will look immediately much more like a creased area. I haven't done that very well here, so it's not as immediate, but I think I do go back to it later on. But from certain angles now, you can start to see that it is starting to smooth everything out, and it looks more like one flowing piece of fabric as opposed to lots of small sections. Oh, the other thing as well is when you're building it, there are some small gaps in the model from the cape, just from the way that you put it together. I ended up having to glue this one in order to make sure that it didn't come apart when I was painting. I think I glued quite a lot of this one together, but even then there are still some gaps just from it being a push fit model. There's nothing wrong with this. It wasn't going to win any golden demons or anything like that from the get-go, but if you do want it to be as perfect as possible, there's plenty of videos online. I know Ninjon's got one, Squidmar's got some, even Goobertown's probably done several on them at this point because he's very good like that. Is just to see how to assemble push fits without having to have the huge gaps into them. And at this stage it is starting to look good, but you can still see that we've lost some of our highlight there, and it's not as smooth as perhaps it could be. So we're thinning down that mixture of dark plum and white, and now we're glazing the other direction, so we're glazing back in our highlights. This isn't something that I do too often. As I said, with the way that I normally paint, I use a thicker paint for the highlights because then I make sure that it is there, but with some areas like this you have to do it. It may actually be easier if you are struggling to build up your smooth highlights to apply them with a glaze, because it's a lot more forgiving as you're going along. I might do a video on this at some point if someone reminds me. But all I'm doing here is just glazing in over those highlights as carefully as I can, but because it's a glaze, as I said, it is a lot more forgiving. And this is just to reshape where our highlights are and to make sure that they are opaque again. This also helps to remove any tide marks that we may have built up from the glaze going the other direction. happy with your cape, you could leave it here, but because I am a glutton for punishment, I decided to do some freehand all over it, and not the simple kind of freehand either. No, I decided to try and paint a bird skull on it. They may wonder why a bird skull. Well, Mordor is traditionally associated with ravens, I believe. There are a lot of sort of animal iconography all over the model, and so I thought there's not really anything of a bird there. Plus, the Lord Veritant does come with a griff crow, so I thought that might look kind of cool. Probably could have done it a bit bigger just to save my sanity, but hey. And all I'm doing with this one is I'm using some dark green brown, the same as we used for the gold, with a size 00 brush from Winsor & Newton, a Series 7 one. Other brushes are available. Artisope was probably fine. Any brush that you're comfortable with, has a good tip, and you trust to do what you want is absolutely fine. And all I'm doing is just sketching in the design that I want. Because it's a tiny area, it's not as easy as I would have liked, but I have tried to get it all on camera for you. And once I'm happy with the general shape, I just start blocking in the main, kind of like the main outline of it. And this just, again, helps to give me something to work in. And then it just becomes, I suppose, filling in and colouring in at that point, which is much easier. Now, the beak isn't perhaps as sharp as I would have liked it, but the other reason why we used dark plum for our glazes and for our base coat is because we can then use that as a eraser if we need to. So any areas that we've made a mistake, we can just go back over with some dark plum, thinned down quite a bit, almost to a glaze, but sort of like a thick glaze, so it may take a couple, but we can paint over those areas and then it will give us a nice sharp highlight. In fact, probably the best way of getting sharp highlights is to actually remove some areas as opposed to painting it on in the first place. Now I've zoomed in here just so you can see me painting the eye sockets there and trying to do the nasal cavity too. The nose didn't really come out as well on... Well, actually, it worked quite well on that side. It doesn't on the other. The other one didn't come out as well, but you can't really tell because you can't see both of them at the same time. But as you can see here, all I'm doing is just refining the nose by just adding some more dark plum and taking some out of the dark green brown? Yes, dark green brown that we used before. And again, if you want a simple piece of freehand, you could do that in black or white or anything like that, and it'll be a nice, almost I suppose deco kind of look to it. Me being me, I decided to do a lot of it in non-metallic gold. I just thought it would be a little easier. Now for this I'm filling in most of the area because the dark green brown is really only useful as a base tone. I'm leaving it in some areas for shadow. This is down for purely sort of like artistic license, you can do however you wish, but I'm just trying to sort of use that to mark out where I want my highlights to be. And going in and repainting the edges. This is tricky. If you want to give it a go, please do, because freehand always looks impressive, even if it's something that you're not entirely pleased with. Even having a go is impressive in and of itself. But when you're painting the edges, you don't have to get them entirely spot on. You can just go back with some of your base tone and paint over it. And again, you could stop here if that's bright enough for you or it matches your overall design. I'm going a step further again by using some of the bright yellow ochre now on top of it. It's a bit of a quicker process doing this because it's a much smaller area, and it does give me a chance that you can see just how the paints work together and how they can develop into a gold very easily. And if you are worried about your ability to put in sort of highlights in the place that they need to go or getting the shapes to look right, that all comes with practice. I normally find that when I'm doing any piece of freehand, I'll draw it out in a sketchbook beforehand, and I'll try and sort of do the design first and then make it smaller and smaller until I can do it from memory without needing to draw on construction lines or anything like that. Sometimes I'll just go straight for it and just dive in head first with abandon. You can do this, I don't recommend it. Do as I say, not as I do in that regard. But if you are struggling with this, it will just come with practice. And again, as you get more used to non-metallics, you will learn all of these things. Like I didn't go to art school. I've never had any formal artistic training. This is all predominantly self-taught or from watching YouTube videos on the topic. So anyone can do all of this, even if you're just schlub like me with a paintbrush. But after having applied the bright pale yellow, that's the name of it, I've got all the way up to the brightest points for the goldy bits, I suppose. There probably is a word for this that I'm forgetting, but yeah, the gold parts of there, and then I'm just going back with some dark plum and re-outlining the area so that it is nice and sharp. All of the areas where I've perhaps missed a little or my eyes aren't as good, I can just cover them over so it looks like I never made a mistake. And here, all you have to do is just keep your hands as steady as possible and try and draw a straight line on a curved edge, following it and keeping it exactly equal around there at all times. I do not do this, and so it looks fine on its own, and we can basically say that, well, the cape was clearly billowing as they were walking forward, so that's why it's not straight. It's clearly the cape's fault, not mine. I think Sergio Calvo likes to draw his on with a pencil before he starts doing it. I've tried this, but I find it quite difficult to then notice where I've put the pencil marks because I prefer them to be a bit lighter than that. So you can just paint them straight on, but again, try and have a brush that you trust, that you know what it's doing, and don't put too much paint on at once. It just saves you from any maladies, and then it's easier to paint over if you need to. Now, because we're going for more of a death and gothic theme, I thought rather than just having a normal square bordered edge, at this point I was again considering whether to put some roses up the side and sort of look like that it's roses growing in a tangle up the side of the cape. I was tempted to do this, but I just thought it might then look a bit busy because it's already quite a busy model. So I thought I would do the long edges as almost like a scythe and then do some thorns coming off them. Still debating as to whether to put a rose on that main sort of billowing section that we just highlighted, but considering we spent so long highlighting it, I eventually scrapped the idea and just decided to leave it be. I think this was the best option. And here you can see I'm just reapplying some areas. I didn't get it entirely, well, it doesn't look too good there. You can see where I've actually splashed some paint over it. The light is hitting it at a dodgy angle, but I did get the brush too far there. I will just paint over it. Again, it's not the end of the world, it's easy to fix. And here I am just applying another layer of the dark green brown just to really make sure that that is painted in, because that's basically like doing a base coat. decided to have a horizontal border as well, so decided to do a horizontal line going across all of that area. This again did not follow the general shape of it at all. I think it goes up in the middle and then goes down again and has some bumps in it. You can't really tell once it's done though, so do not worry about making sure that it's perfect and sort of trying to do it with a ruler. It doesn't really matter because it's a cloak, it's going to be billowing, it's going to be stretching from the fabric and everything. You can see I have highlighted the vertical section, but I'm just following now around with the horizontal section, following the same recipe with the gold. My camera wants to bloom here, I don't know why it's focusing on that. It does remember what it's doing in a second. But as you can see, I am highlighting that middle area where we've spent the time to glaze it up to a highlight. This is to sort of follow, and this is actually something that I learned from Flavion from looking at his work again, is that when you are doing freehand designs, if you've got light that would hit it naturally anyway, or where you've painted on light onto the area, realistically that would be where light would hit on the design too, so you can do that as well. You can of course put highlights in as the design for it, which is what I've done in the past, but this has always looked like a little artificial, and this way it does look a lot more natural. And here you can see that I'm just painting over that line, trying to put the highlights in for where they would go. is finished, we've got a nice solid line that follows and is highlighted in the same areas. I didn't record the other line because it was getting a bit late at this point, so I did it off camera. But here you can see now that it is finished. The right hand side of the cape did not go as well as the left hand side, but as I said, you can't see both of them at the same time, so it's unlikely that anybody will notice. But the other thing that we can do now is similar to what we did with the gold when we were painting it, is that we can start to maximize the shadows on the freehand as well, and to desaturate sections of it. This works really nicely in some areas. In others, I think, again, it was quite a warm day, so I have got quite a lot of coffee staining, and I could have gone back to tidy it up, but I couldn't be bothered. So all we're doing is, with some thinned down black, we are glazing over our freehand, which is terrifying, I do realise, because you've just spent all this time working on it and now you've got to paint over it. So do tend to make sure that your paint is a little thinner than what I'm using here. That could also be what I'm doing it. As soon as I bring it back onto camera, you can see that this makes the shadows deeper and enhances our highlights again, but it also just makes the freehand look like it follows all of the designs that are, and all of the shape of the cape a little bit more. Or would if you could see it, of course. So for this one, we have a highlight there, so we're dragging our brush towards where we want it to be the darkest point. And this time I chose to be kind of the middle of that area, so we do have a darker area next to our shaded point. Again, paint was probably a little too thick at this point, but it does make it quite dramatic, I suppose. And because this side didn't look quite as well, I decided, well, I'll just glaze over it and then it can look like it's in shadow and it's stretched slightly. So again, if your freehand doesn't perhaps look quite as good, you can fix it afterwards, or you can just disguise it with some other stuff. And by stuff, I mean glazing. A few more just little adjustments to it, adding in some dark plum, some more black, and just tidying it up a little bit more. The cape is done, and we can move on to chapter 4, where we'll be looking at some chainmail. Now, I forgot to record the palette for this one because, again, a couple of days had gone by, and I think I remember what the recipe was. I started with a mixture of black and dark umber from Pro Acryl. Now, the dark umber is a warmer tone, but mixed with a little black we can desaturate it. Now, we don't want this to be too brown. In a lot of the heavy metal paint jobs for a lot of the Ruination Chamber, all of the chainmail is slightly weathered, but it's not to the point that it's rusty. It just sort of looks like it's a bit, it is a different form of metal. And I kind of like that. I have painted one of them already where it is the same silver as I've done with the contrast paints, but it doesn't look quite right, so I will paint over that by the time it comes to be on a video. But all I'm doing here is just base coating with that black and dark umber mix. Now, it's not going on too well because I did make the paint a little bit too thick, just so that I didn't get any excess paint onto the areas that I was painting around it, like the metallics that we just spent so much time on. Probably could have been a bit less cautious in this regard and wiped it off if need be, but just in this case, because it is a darker tone, I didn't really want to add in too much. And once that's dried, you can see we do have these nice darker sections of it. And to highlight it, I am just adding a little bit of white, in this case some more Schmincke titanium white, to the point where we have almost by adding the black in, we're sort of greying the dark umber. So it still can look slightly metallic, so we're just adding grey to the dark umber. If you don't have a white or you don't want to, you can just add something like the bright warm grey that we used before and go from there. But all I'm doing with a size 00 brush is almost sort of over brushing with it, which is kind of like dry brushing but with a slightly more wet paint, where I've got not too much paint onto the rest, but I'm just running it over it to catch those highlighted areas. I don't want to paint the entire area in this highlight tone because I still want it to look like it's got some shape to it and that the metal is only catching at certain points, but I still want it to look metallic. So I'm just painting it over here. If you need to, just feel free to hold the model at any orientation that you want. I'm only holding it sideways just because the sword is in the way. But as soon as you're happy with that, you can add a little bit more white and go on to the next step. With this, we are adding it so there's almost up to, probably be a sort of mid highlight at this point, so it's just adding another bit more white to it. And now, rather than overbrushing, we are selectively picking out some of the links in the chainmail to highlight. Now, I'm picking the ones that follow that main central highlight that we have on the breastplate itself, so that it looks like the light is still hitting it and it is all one area being affected by light rather than lots of smaller areas being affected by light. One of the sort of major traps that you can fall into with non-metallics that I've fallen into myself is that you can think that you need to highlight everything with its own unique light source. It can work and it can look good, but you don't have to. And it will generally look better if you have one global light source, I suppose. And with this, again, with the lower chainmail, I'm doing is just picking out smaller areas. And once you've done that, you can add another little bit more white, this time we're being very, very careful, almost with pure white, and we're just dabbing on some little points of sort of like very, very brightest points. So this is where it will be glinting in the sun. And again, we're following that main central highlight so that it's only the areas that we want to draw the eye to. Again, it shouldn't draw the eye too much. It doesn't need to be too bright. It's just a little bit of extra just to show that it is the same texture of it, but it's not too over the top, if that makes sense. Nice short chapter, that one. Now we move on to the Armour trim. So again, we're going back to dark plum for this. We start with a base coat of pure dark plum, same that we used on the cape, and being very, very careful. Again, probably should have done this before I did the chainmail. You can do these in either order. I personally prefer to do the main thing first and then the trim, just being very, very careful. I do get a little bit of the dark plum onto the chainmail at times, but because it's a nice darker colour, you can't really see it too much, so it doesn't need too much of a cleanup. Now on the, I want to say tabard, it may not be. I know the term tabard gets thrown around a lot, but on the trim of that, I'm just adding in some bands of light that are hitting it. I don't want to paint the entire area in it, but some areas that are still black I can just use as shadows later, but I'm just really maximizing the different points that are working in there. Again, following the shape of it, following our overall highlights, and just making sure that it's nice and neat. We don't get any paint onto those metallic areas, but even if you do, you've got enough other fabric areas around it that you could turn it into a reflection later if you get something you don't notice, or if you do notice, just wipe it off with a wet brush. At this point, not that you can see it, but I am painting the shoulder pad that is partially obscured by the cape. Now, at this point, I thought I'd maybe made a mistake that I shouldn't have done the trim in the same dark plum, because I've got two examples of dark plum next to one another. In fact, that they are touching. But because I'm going to be highlighting one as a metallic and one is remaining as fabric, I thought I could probably get away with not pushing it too far. As well as it's got the other metallic sections and the insignia of Sigmar. I think it's the death mask of Sigmar, in fact, on the shoulder pad anyway. Anyway, now we are adding in some white to that area, similarly to what we did with the cape. So just use the same recipe as that, and we're adding it more, and we're just reapplying some highlights, following the shape and indeed the other highlights that we have already placed. Again, being very careful not to get paint on the other areas, as I nearly did just then. Now you'll notice as well that I'm not edge highlighting this particular section at this point. I'm just painting over the top of what I'd done before. This is intentional because I wanted it to look brighter so that it didn't look like it was a dark plum metallic that was just being highlighted and catching the light. I wanted it to be that it was a solid purple metallic so that it was building up the light in some way. It's also a really tiny section, and so edge highlighting is a pain, which is why I only do it later on. It's a bit easier with the tabard, and so I do some edge highlights with that as well, but that's because I can hold the model upside down. And you can see here that I'm just using roughly the same points as I marked on when I started, but I'm also considering where the light is hitting on that sort of gold ornamentation we have on the calf, so that where that specular highlight is, we've got them following in a line from there. I'm also separating the highlights on the bottom with that tiny band of shadow just at the tip. This helps to make it look metallic, sort of really, because we do have, as I've said before, an area of highlight facing an area of shadow. Right, and now we're being very, very careful using just the tip of the brush, and now we do some edge highlights on that section. Now, this is quite tricky because it is a teeny tiny area, so what I normally do is I put a little bit of paint just on the tip of the brush, and then I do edge highlight just with the tip rather than the side. This does take a little bit of practice, so if you've got a teeny tiny brush like a Artist Opus Series M size 000, I think it is, or 00, whichever the tiny one is, that might be useful here, but you will have to keep reloading it. I used a Winsor & Newton one just because I could kind of get into there and painting it, but if you are a little bit shaky with this kind of thing, just use a tiny brush. Or skip this section if you don't want to do it, because with the previous highlights it does look okay on its own. do start adding a few elements of pure white here, thinned down quite carefully so that it's not overpowering stuff, but just to, especially on the shoulder pad, to show that it is a metallic design as opposed to some of the other areas which may not necessarily be. But once you've done that, you have done the trim, which is probably the most finicky part of it, and that includes the freehand. And then we're on to chapter 6, the black cloth. Nice palette cleanser after this because it doesn't use too many colours. Now black is a bit of a pain to paint because quite often you think, well, black is black, you can't really highlight it. I mean, you can highlight it, but it may not necessarily look like black at the end. Now a trick that I use is I generally don't highlight it up as much. I add a little bit of white to it to turn it into a grey, and then I'll glaze black over the top because you want black to be the predominant colour of it. Sort of like you want it to be 75% black and then 25% highlight. And since you don't need to see me base coating black, now all I've done is add a tiny touch of white to it, so probably maybe half a brush tip to the black. I do have a hair on the end of my brush and it's annoying me here, so apologies for that. But all I'm doing is just adding that nice dark grey, so all it is black with a tiny amount of white, and I'm looking at the areas where I have my highlights from the metal and also any curves and any area that's perpendicular, like we did with the other cape. And I'm just painting these on nice and wide. You can be a bit more playful with this if you want to and have some lines that you want to experiment with, or just paint a lot of it more because we will be glazing black over the top, and any highlights that you put now will just add volume to the cape when it is finished. Once we've blocked those in, I am adding a little bit more white to it in order to have a fairly light grey, not too light I suppose, but I'm just edge highlighting here and applying a secondary highlight over those areas that we've just highlighted. And that's probably as bright as I'll go. I'm also adding, as you can see here, an outline around the hip plate there to sort of look like reflected light coming from it, and then filling in the gap in between it. Having this outline leaves a tiny amount of black, like I was talking about on the foot armour when we did that, but having that line just adds a little bit of black underneath it from where the model would naturally have that shadow, and so it just helps to reinforce that this is something that is layered on top of it. And much like we did for the large billowing section on the back of the cape, we're just adding little highlights into the middle there. considered leaving the black here because it looked all right at this stage, but I then decided to add a tiny touch more white to it to get it a little bit brighter, to do some edge highlighting, and as well to just maximize some of those highlights just to make it a little bit more dramatic. You don't have to if you don't want to. I just thought it needed it at this point. Use your own judgment for whether it needs to go brighter. And as you can see, I'm just pulling the brush towards those areas where light would naturally catch, and keeping the paint nice and thin as I do so. You just thin down some black and glaze over the top of those areas until it is smooth like we did on the back of the cape. And that's the finished result. I have made them a little bit smaller than perhaps I'd marked out. This was probably because when I was looking at it, I just thought, I've got all of these extra volumes, but they don't need to be that bright. And you may encounter the same thing, or you may think that they need it a little bit more. Now, for the next section, we'll be doing the leather on all of the belts and some of the straps from keeping like the armour panel on. But you can see that we've not got too much left. We've only really got the head, the weapons, the shield, some of the minor details, and all of those. So it's still a bit of a long way to go, but these sections are a bit sort of smaller and a bit more focused. Now, leather is something that I enjoy painting, but it often goes a bit wrong for me. You'll also notice I've changed the lids on my Pro Acryl paints because the twist caps just annoy me so much. But for this section, we'll be using caramel brown, dark umber, bright pale yellow, and a touch of transparent orange. The transparent orange is a new colour to the palette. We only really use it in this case because it just adds some warmth. Now, over the base coat of black and dark umber, same that we used for the chainmail, I'm applying some pure caramel brown in any areas that look like they're folded, the edges, and then painting some solid lines across them in using the tip of the brush to add some streaks from where the leather might be cracked or from where it is weathered. Now, leather is a bit tricky because if you highlight it normally and just go for all of the edges, it can look fine, or it can look a bit artificial. It kind of depends on the size of the area that you're going for, and you can do it with dry brushing or any other number of techniques. Obviously we can't do dry brushing on this one because it's tiny and we've painted all of the other areas. So this is my way that I like to go about it. There are thousands of others. I know Andy Wardle has a fantastic tutorial on how to do it on the Cult of Paint. I think it's on the Patreon one, might be on their YouTube, but I remember seeing it on the Patreon. Now, for what I normally do is I build up these lines as weathering, and then I would normally glaze over the top of them, because as you glaze over them it pushes all of these lines back and it just makes them look so that they are in line. They're not quite as stark against some of the other areas. In doing so, this can really help to show the different ages of the material. It also can add some warmth to it if you want to. In this case, all I'm doing now is with a little bit more of the caramel brown and a touch of the bright pale yellow, adding in some brighter highlights again, just to add some weathering. It doesn't matter what we do at this point, you just want it to look fairly random, as if the belts have been pulled tight, or maybe they've been cut at some point, the metal's dug into it, maybe the Night Vigilant has missed the scabbard with that dagger and stabbed it a few too many times, I don't know. But just to give it a bit more sort of age to it. Or alternatively, as I've said, if you want to make it look very new, just do some edge highlighting to go for the curves and all of that, and then it will still look like leather. Leave it because it is nicely weathered, but it was blending in a little too much with some of the areas around it for my liking at this point, and this is where the transparent orange can come in very well. Adding some transparent orange and dark umber to the palette and thinning it down to a very thin glaze, like you can barely see it's making a dent on my thumbnail there. We glaze this over the entire area. Now, because we've got some highlights there with the bright pale yellow mixed in, these will immediately take on the orangeness of it, and so we are staining the highlights at this point. Doing so makes leather a lot warmer. It also makes it stand out because we've got that what's known as a temperature contrast. We've got all of these colder areas around it, and we're adding some warmth. Once we've done that, when I bring the model back, we can see that it has dried somewhat, and now with that mix of the dark umber and the transparent orange, I've just mixed in some more of the bright pale yellow and the caramel brown, and we're reapplying some highlights. These are over some of the same areas as we've looked at before. These are really maximising some of the weathering of it. These could be horizontal lines, some streaks. If by the end of it, if you wanted to sort of go back, you can just use some pure dark umber and do some solid lines to look like deep gashes in it if you want to. It's entirely down to you. It just depends on how weathered you want them to be. because I did originally intend to just do a solid line against the scabbard to make it look newer than all of the others, as if this is a weapon that has been sort of like a newly presented one, or it's something that hasn't been used much. But it didn't really look right, so I thought, well, I'll try and do some more distressed areas onto the side to make it follow where I wanted the lines to be. But again, it didn't quite work, and I think this is from when I was building it. I might have dented it a little when I was pressing the part in. So the line doesn't really look right, and I did fuss over it for quite a while, glazing with dark umber, caramel brown, and all of the sort of other points in between. By the time it was finished, I basically can't tell that I've done any of this because I was a bit heavy-handed with it, but it looked better than it does now. So if it ever goes wrong for you in terms of leather, go back to your base tone, glaze over the top of it. You can use a thicker glaze if you want, and it'll push everything that you've done quite far back, and you can just have another go. It's one of the great bonuses of leather. It doesn't really matter how many times it takes you. Slightly out of focus, but then back again. You can see that this is when I've reached the end of the leather, and we can move on to the metallic trim. Now for these bits, these are the teeny tiny sections of metal that we have around the middle of the piece there. I've base coated them in black, which makes them nigh impossible to see on the footage, I now notice. But I promise that they're there. These are things like the sort of metal, whatever it is at the end of the belt buckle itself, and any other small metallic details. And to make these stand out a little bit more so they don't blend in with the armour, all I'm doing is using black and white to highlight these. Now this is the simplest way that you can do non-metallic silver. You start with a base coat of black, you add in some white, turn it into a grey, and you highlight as normal. You then keep adding white until you're up to pure white, and just keep adding more and more to your highlights. And you can see just on the little emblem at the end of the tabard, if it is a tabard, that's precisely what I'm doing, and in many places you could just stop if it becomes bright enough for you. I've decided to take it all the way up to pure white just to really maximise it and make it all nice and shiny. If you don't want to go for a shiny effect, you don't have to go up to pure white. the edges weren't perhaps as bright as they could be, so I went back and added the pure white over the top, and I think this really does sell what they are at this stage, and it was something that was missing before. But now we can move on to the weapons. Or the weapon hafts, anyway. We don't actually get to the weapons until later on. Now, I actually recorded this while I was on a Discord call, which is why it probably goes off camera a little more, but I couldn't decide on what colours to do the weapon hafts, because in the box art they are a sort of magenta, and I thought, well, that could look cool, but then it will blend in with the cape, and it'll look like that they've torn off bits of the cape and they've attached it to it, which could work if the cape was perhaps a bit more weathered. I then thought, well, maybe I could do it with a desaturated blue and use the same tone as I've used in the armour. But as it's then you've got the armoured gauntlet holding both of them, this would look far too similar, and it could, because I'm again highlighting with white, it could blend in too much. And at this point I realised, well, I will just do it black, and because black goes with everything. And it also enhances the nice gothy feeling. In fact, this person could easily be listening to Susie and the Banshees while they're wandering along. But with the black, I'm just making sure that I have a nice opaque base coat, and then I'm adding white to each of my highlights as subsequent things, and just highlighting any areas that I think light would go. Again, with these, you can be a bit you have some creative freedom with them. You can paint them however you want. I've just decided to go for some general lights hitting the top edge of each of the sort of like the folded and layered leather effect onto there, and I've gone for that, and then some of the body following the line and the shape of the metal into it being sort of like a solid line going down the end. You'll be able to see by the end of it if that doesn't make sense, but you can paint it however you want, or you can just paint it black and do a light dry brush over that sort of area, and it will look fine either way. rather crisper edge highlights to those sections. And hopefully it makes sense as what I was talking about by having the highlighting the upper edges and making sure that they follow in a line. Again, you can do it however you wish, or you can skip this part if you just want to have them a solid black. But now we can move on to painting even more gold. I know we've missed it. Now I've base coated them with the dark green brown as I did on the Armour panels, and then at this point I noticed that the black cloth was perhaps missing something, and on the box art they have this rather nice sort of, I suppose, like a Sigma-esque sunburst kind of thing, or starburst I suppose, and I thought, well, it looks kind of good, so I'll paint one on there. And this is using the exact same recipe as I have on all of the other gold sections and the back freehand, but just so you can see how it would look on the gold as well, I've decided to show you it here. This is something that you may encounter when you are painting your models. You may suddenly notice that there's an area that you'd perhaps discounted before as perhaps being too busy, but then when you've got more things blocked in, you may suddenly notice that it just needs something to really make it pop, or to add visual interest to that area. If you've got some large areas that perhaps they look really good on their own, but it's just like from every single angle, it might just be missing something or something that ties it to the rest of it. Try adding in some little emblematic designs or some weathering, or like a splash of mud here and there can help to sell where it is in the world. It could be a slight tear here and there, it could be a spatter of blood if you wanted to. If you've got something that could be glowy from OSL, you can do that too. In this case, I decided to just do some freehand because it was what I was feeling at the time. And hopefully you can see what I'm doing here. instances where I decided not to glaze over it with black, predominantly because it is on a black surface already, but also I wanted just to make it look like that it is a final memory of some of the things to do with Sigmar, that it's that nice connection to it and to link them to the army. Anyway, on to chapter 11, where we look at some purple gems. Now, if you want some more detail as to how to paint gems, I have done a video on painting a sort of stained glass or gemstone effect on a Soulblight Gravelord's shield. It's using the exact same process, in fact probably uses the exact same paints now that I think about it, but all we're doing is base coating with dark purple here and adding white into all of the mixes for each subsequent highlight. This is very simple, and I chose to use dark purple here because I have a prosecutor from Skaventide that's kind of been my test model for all of these, and from when I've been sort of sitting on Discord with people on my Discord server, I've needed something to paint so that I didn't need to record at the same time, mainly because OBS was messing up a little. But for when I was painting that, I'd made some creative leaps with the colour scheme that has helped to define how I was going to paint some other things, and with that, it did dictate that I kind of needed some dark purple areas to it. It also still fits in with the story that I wanted to tell, because a lot of the things from more back in the old world and fantasy were still purple, and it was the sort of like the amethyst school of magic. Now in Age of Sigmar, I believe that has been supplanted by Nagash, but we do still have these older, more archaic death gods that are still existing within the lore, and because I want to follow with that, I thought, well, we'll continue with the amethyst effect, and so we'll have amethysts in for all of the gems that are there. The ones on the sword are absolutely tiny, and I think I actually forgot to highlight the one on the underside too much, but because they are so tiny, you can just put a dot of white onto the end. You'll also notice that I painted all of the hafts of the weapons and all of the gold up to maximum at this point. I didn't decide to record this, partially because I forgot and thought I was recording, but in fact I was even talking to myself while I was doing it, and I imagine that if anybody was listening at the time, they thought I was quite mad, but it just follows the exact same recipe as the other gold. I just used the alternate application method of doing it, where you start with the base and build it up slowly, like I've done in all of the freehand sections. I do show this later on when we get to the final detail section on some trinkets. It's on a little bit of a smaller area, so it doesn't quite show the full effect. But it's the same principle, you just build it up in the same way as we have done before, but as I'm going to be doing a lot more Stormcast in the next one, I will show how I use the gold to bring it up into my style of painting, just to give you some variety of it. Now with the purple gems as well, I also considered doing some glow from these onto the hip plates, but I thought if I'm doing the glow from the swords and the brazier anyway, it probably isn't worth it, as it'll get washed out, or it will just make a sort of brown or green mess over the area, grey rather, mess over the area, and I didn't really like that idea, so I thought I'll just stick with them as being gems, and then I can do one glow coming from one area. as close to done as we can get them, just adding a few more dabs of pure white there. We get the finished effect of this. Convenient camera cut there. Now we don't have too much left. We have the head, we have the weapons, the brazier is perhaps the brightest point there. We've also got a few minor details and the shield, obviously. But with all of these, it is starting to come together, and we can see that there is more and more life being brought into it. And at this stage, I kind of wanted to get it all finished, so I did start brushing some areas. You may encounter that you do this as well. Oh, I've also got the cameo and the insignia on the side panel there, but we'll get to those eventually. But now we paint the head. Now, it's coming with the preface that while I have enjoyed painting skin in the past, I didn't enjoy this one, probably because the head that is on the Lord Veritant isn't good. I started with a base coat of beige red using some glazes, and I thought I might have to add some dark umber to it to add some warmth to it as well. I then remembered that I've got dark warm flesh and warm flesh again just in their pots already, so I thought, well, I could use them for highlighting, and because to have some universal highlights to it, I thought we'll use bright pale yellow again because it will help to link them. So I start with a base coat of beige red, built up with glazes. This is something that I learned from Cult of Paint. If you have a zenithal that you haven't painted over yet, using a glaze to build up your skin tones is really useful because it will get into all of the nooks and crannies, but it also doesn't fill in those details. It will help to show them off a bit more, and it'll make painting the face a lot easier. Plus, as I painted all the stuff around it at this point, having a glaze just meant that if I did get any paint onto it, it wouldn't matter too much. I then realised that beige red probably wasn't dark enough, so I added some burnt orange to the mix, and this immediately looks a lot more Caucasian. It makes it darker, but it does go for the desired sort of darker flesh that we're going for. Looks a little like Cadian flesh tone if you use the Citadel paints, and if you are using them, just use that. It'll probably be a lot much easier. If you want to use the same paints as I'm doing, just mix a bit of burnt orange in. Now, this wasn't the easiest to capture on camera because I had to keep turning it so I didn't get it onto the collar or the headdress thingy. But once it is finished, we have a nice solid colour that looks like this. They look a bit sunburnt at this point. I did go a little bit over the blindfold here and there, but I do paint that at the end. But once you've got a nice solid base coat on that, we can start to add some dark warm flesh. Now, I started off by adding this as a mixture of our base tone and the dark warm flesh, but I did eventually just use pure dark warm flesh because the base coat, there wasn't too much of a step between them. If you do want to go up where it's ultra smooth and you want to make sure that it all looks very natural and you're doing all of this, you could use that mix, but I just wanted to get them nice and done quite quickly because I don't really like the head that they've put onto this model. I can see why they've done it, and I like the blindfold idea of it, that they are blind and they're using the Griff Crow to kind of see where all the magic is. But there's just something about the head, and I've tried to disguise it too much by actually twisting it slightly in the pin, so most of it is covered by the collar. This is past me thinking that this is a good idea, and then painting me realising that this just makes it harder to paint. If you have done this, you may wish to actually push it the other direction, or leave it off and then just glue it in afterwards. If you cut the pegs off, that might be easier. But here you can see that I'm just applying some of the dark warm flesh from, I think that's one of them from the Ninjon set, actually. Worth getting, I seem to use a lot of those paints from it. But I'm just painting them on following where light would naturally hit the face if it was being lit from the side with the brazier. Now, this is kind of planning that I'm going to do OSL on it later, because if I make sure all of my highlights are on that side from the get-go, I can really ensure that it's easier to just glaze the highlight or the light colour over that. I also wasn't too sure as to whether I was going to go for a regular flame in the brazier or something a bit more magical at this stage. I ended up going with something a bit more magical, as you shall see later, but I thought if I use the dark warm flesh as opposed to some of the others, that warmth won't look out of place with the fire, and in fact it might blend in a bit more and make life easier. I don't know whether this is true or not, but I might try it out on a different miniature. And you can see as the paint is wet, and actually now that it is all dry, that building it up into the layers, we do have a fairly decent skin tone here, and we have still got some in the scars. But now I'm adding some pure warm flesh into the mix, just to highlight it a little bit more and focusing on the raised areas or areas that are facing the light. Now, because she is bald, I decided to have a spherical highlight on the top of the head, following it so that it only really covers the side facing the brazier. But I also wanted to make sure that the sort of like the brow ridge, or facing it anyway, also does have a highlight, because of course that would be where the sun would be hitting as well. If you wanted to push this even further and wanted to look like she's sort of freshly shaved her head, you can glaze some sort of like a dark blue-grey over it, because that's kind of what stubble goes for. Same if you want to do sort of like a 5 o'clock shadow on certain like marines or anything like that. Now my hand does get in the way of this area, so you can't see some areas just because I was trying to get the bristles in between the collar and the face there. But one thing to just keep in mind is that if you do put any of the highlights where you don't necessarily need them, we will be glazing over the top anyway. So these are easily fixable, they don't have to be perfect. In fact, mine are rarely perfect when I'm painting skin. And now we just add some of the bright pale yellow into that mix. Couldn't show the paint there because my camera decided to start blooming and making all the colours really washed out. I suspect that's the setting that I've turned on accidentally. I shall have to go through and sort that out. But all we're doing is just reapplying these highlights with the bright pale yellow mixed into all of the areas that need to be brightest. And you can see that it is starting to look a bit more like skin now, and it's looking a bit more natural. And I'm choosing to highlight only the tops and the creases of like the cheek and like the mouth, and of course onto the head, because that's going to get the most light hitting it. I'm also making sure to follow the general placement that I did before, so that it's predominantly over towards the side of the brazier to make life easy with the OSL. Because skin is tricky, by the end of it you'll probably have to do some glazing. So just with some of the mixes that I'd used before, in this case it was the base tone mix with the beige red and the burnt orange mixed in, I just glazed towards the shadows to re-maximize them in order to show that there was a darker side to the face and to bring in some of the details that may have been lost, also to sort of reinforce the shape of the head there. Didn't take too many glazes because of course as we're using a bright colour when we're glazing over it, it does take quite well to it. But just glaze until you think it looks natural. If you go too far, just reapply your highlights. And with that done, we have a head that looks like this. You can see there's a nice fade from one side to the other. We can clearly see that the light is coming from one direction. It's not the smoothest of ones in the world because, I mean, the head just, it's not great. I will stop complaining about that in a minute, I promise. But it will do, I think is the best way. And once I've painted the blindfold, it looked like this, and you can see that I think with the blindfold it does sell it a bit more. I had thought about maybe doing some glowing eyes through it, and sort of making it look like the sort of gossamer or sheer fabric effect. I think we'll save that for another video though, on something a bit larger, possibly the Sonari Cathalar that I might paint up for a spearhead. Anyway, on to probably the most interesting part, Chapter 13, the weapons and the OSL. For this we're using a combination of dark purple, transparent blue, and coal black. And some white. White isn't pictured there, forgot about that. But this is because I decided, and I've been playing Elden Ring quite a lot, and I thought I would probably use some glintstone as an inspiration for the swords. But I didn't really want it to be that sort of brighter turquoise that you normally find or get killed by when you're going through Raya Lucaria. So I thought that I'll go for use a purple as a base towards it, which I think came out quite well into the end. But we're starting off by painting the weapons with the Dark Sea Ben mix and black that we used on the armour. Only this time, rather than using the bright warm grey, we're using pure white. this is a very subtle change. It doesn't make a huge amount of difference, but it just shows that there is this slight difference between the armour and the weapons. Also, by using white, it means that we don't have any colours that might stain it by using the bright warm grey when we come to do the glow onto it, because having the white just means that we can kind of use it as a blank canvas, as it were. But all I'm doing in here is just base coating with a mixture of dark sea Ben and black, keeping the paint nice and thin so it runs into all of the runes and stuff that's on the edge of the sword. And I'm doing 2 coats of that until it is solid, and then I add a tiny dash of more dark sea Ben into the mix and start blocking in the highlights. This is similar to when I did the highlight frame on all of the others. I also hit the edges. Now for the side that has the flame hitting it, I make sure that all of the actual parts of the metal that are not part of the flame, they are still painted, because I don't want it to look like that it's the sword melting. I want it to look like that the flame is on the surface of the sword. So adding in some dark sea Ben, I then do some edge highlighting. I then add some white to that mix, and then start applying some sort of blobs of highlight. If you want more detail on this, the Army Painter Fanatic review that I did, probably I think it was the last video that I put up, long ago that was, I do cover how to do non-metallic swords on that in some more detail, admittedly using different paints. In this case it's just adding white to black and dark sea Ben from Acrylic. But all I'm doing here is just edge highlighting and adding in blocks of highlights around the blade to look like where light would hit it. And we're making sure that these are all opaque and then building up the highlights as we go. This is a general pattern that I go for. You don't have to be too precise as to whether they're all realistic for them. I just generally put some light where I think it looks the best. I generally like to have for the tips of swords anyway, I have the side that's pointing downwards. I make the tip of that of the sword shiny on that side of the blade, and then I do a shadow on the other side. I find that it just makes it look a bit more dramatic. You may find it goes for the other way, or that you just prefer to paint the tip one colour and make the rest your base tone. It's entirely down to you. It will look good no matter what. And here you can see me just maximising the edge highlights. And once we've done that, it's starting to look more sword-like, I suppose. And it's starting to get nice and shiny, but we can take it a little bit further because we basically want to have the blade nearly finished by the time we come to do the flame. Now the other thing as well that I'm trying to make sure is that when I come to do the whiter highlights there, they are a pure white, and that's nice and opaque, as we can see here. Now when we get to the flame, I'm starting with a thinned down wash of the transparent blue from Acrylic. I recommend thinning this down quite a lot because it's quite a strong paint, but already over that white you can already see that it does work quite nicely, and realistically you could leave this here if your zenithal is still strong enough because it looks quite good. You may want to do 2 or 3 coats because when it dries it does fade a little, but this would be more the sort of like glintstone effect that I thought that I might go for, and then I'd go to a more sort of turquoisey colour at the base. After having dried it with a hairdryer, I decided to mix in a little bit of purple, well the dark purple, to the transparent blue, and then glaze this from the middle of the flames down towards the blade itself. This gets a rather nice fade onto it, and we want to use the purple as being kind of at the origin point of the flame. This would be I suppose it would be the orangey part of the flame if it was regular flame. I think it's orange anyway. It's been a while since I've painted fire. But we just make it sure that where it touches the blade, or the central part of it, is more towards purple. Now I've mixed it with the transparent blue to make the blending of it easier. You could just glaze in some of the dark purple regardless and not mix it with the blue. It will probably cover well anyway, but it's just to be on the safer side. You can also at this stage start glazing in some areas onto the blade if you want. I chose to do it in a section afterwards, but there's nothing stopping you from getting there early. And in fact this is a slightly later clip where I'm just adding in some of the transparent blue on top of it because I wanted to double check that it all worked. once we're happy with the fade of the purple, I added in a tiny touch of the white to the purple and started to drag the brush towards the blade itself in order to start highlighting the flames. Now, I didn't add too much white at this point because I still wanted it to look reasonably purple-ish, but this is simply just to start adding in some of the tones that are there. You can also see that I did add some of the purple to the blade at this point, just to, again, test to see whether the scheme would work. I sometimes will often do this, especially when I'm filming, where I will advance it a little bit further just to make sure that the scheme will work, because if not, I can just scrap the footage and start again and paint over it. I've just added a little bit of white to the transparent blue. Probably should have added a little bit more white. It was a bit too transparent at this point. But all I'm doing is just glazing this from the other direction and putting this towards the tips of the flame that I want to be a bit more blue. Now, this is one of the advantages of using a heavy body white paint, because you can use it with transparent paints and it will give it some more body to it, hence the term heavy body. Again, if you're happy with the flames, you could stop here, but I'm going to take it just a little step further. So I've added in a little bit more white, and now I'm dragging the brush towards the tips of the flame in order to highlight them up and to try to make them look just a bit more ethereal, that they're hotter, or just that they are brighter. And you can see on the tips there that it's starting to add some more brightness to it, but I decided that it needed a bit more, so I just went further and further onto it, making sure that some of the areas are a bit brighter, they're a bit more highlighted, and just went around. You can do this to your own discretion onto this. You may want a slightly duller flame, a bit more purple, a bit less blue, anything like that. So just follow along and go as far as you need. I also used this same blue mix to highlight the purple sections, and this was sort of just to tie it together, because if I highlighted it with pure purple, it would just look like the flame is changing, whereas if I had one unifying highlight colour, it would all look like it's part of the same flame. I was happy with how that looked. I just applied some pure white onto the flames in these brightest points, which it does look a little Zechian, I suppose, but it does still have the desired effect, and it does look nice and sort of strange and magical, and it doesn't look like it is a part of the blade that's melting off, I suppose. It also just looks a bit different from the box art. But when you're applying the pure white, you have to just be a little bit careful with it so you don't get it onto the areas where you don't necessarily need it. But you can also, just in the gaps in between all of those flames, sort of where they would be the hottest, you can apply some pure white without any of the sort of build-up to show that it is this hotter section of it. But again, that is down to you. You can decide whether you want to. Once we've got our white highlights all sorted, we can return our attention to the blade itself, because we want to make it look like that the blade is metallic, and so it would reasonably take on some of the colours of the flame. And so from that very top edge, I've already started glazing in the purple and the blue in the previous sections, but we can now just start to reinforce them. So with a thin glaze, as you can see, barely making a applying some of the previous highlights. Now for this, it is Dark Sea Ben with white into it. This is just to reinforce that top edge and to push the highlights a bit more that have got a bit lost here and there. I have also added in some of the transparent blue to it, just to, again, to sort of tint it so it looks like that the highlights are already taking some of those highlights. I also noticed there's some bits of the flame that I missed here and there. The reason why we're re-highlighting it with this colour is because it will help to show that it is taking some glow that is being pushed into the highlights, but it also just helps so that there's not a sudden jump between it. It's kind of like pre-blending, as it were. And here you can see that while I was kind of happy with how it was looking, I thought it still needs to be a bit shinier, so I thought that maybe the white wasn't as opaque as it could be, so I just went back and added in a few more brighter spots into there. This goes for just the flame and the sword itself. Again, this is entirely down to you. You may have got it all right on the first time, I just didn't in this case. shiny flame, and we can get on to the interesting part. Now, this OSL can go wrong. In fact, OSL can go wrong very easily. This is why I tend to do it with glazes, because then it can just look like a slight tint if you can notice that it is going wrong. With the sword, as you can see here, I'm just glazing over some more of the transparent blue, both over the flame this was just to blend it again a bit more because I may have been a bit heavy-handed with the white, but over the blade I'm just glazing it over all of the highlights in order to tint them the same blue as the flame itself. If you're using a different colour, just pick the main colour that you want the light to be and then glaze over with that. If you're using a traditional flame, you'd probably want perhaps an orange, or this case Troll Slayer orange, I think from Citadel is a great one for this, or just Pro Acryl orange in general. But because we've got this glow, it wouldn't just hit the blade, it would hit all of the other areas around it. So I'm glazing the blue over the gold that I painted before. Again, this can seem like when we were painting the freehand on the cape, it can seem terrifying because you're painting over something you've just spent all this time doing it. If it goes wrong though, do not worry. If you've painted it once, you can easily paint it again. And generally you'll be able to be neater this time because you've learned from the first time that you did it. Now in this case, I'm not being too precise, I'm just with a very thinned down transparent blue, just glazing over, always pushing my brush towards where I want the origin of the light to be in order to make sure that it still looks like it's got the majority of the light coming from that direction. I'm also, when the model is sort of like not there, I'm either blowing on the paint to get it to dry a bit quicker because it's being a glaze, or I'm sometimes just tilting the model in order to check to see where the light would hit. Now in this case I want to make sure that the blue is very much on the blade, and so it has tinted all of the lights on the top level blue, but I kind of like that as an effect, and you can do that even if you don't have a flamey bit because it does look like it's just reflecting the sky. Now for the gold, I'm glazing this over, starting with the shadows because again, if it doesn't look right, this is easier to fix, but then when it does start to look all right, I then just glaze over the entire area in a few layers in order to just really make sure that it does have the glow, but it's not overpowering, it's not sort of removing the idea. It still looks like gold, basically, but it looks like gold that's got a light shining on it, as opposed to gold that is turning blue. just finishing off a few last dabs of the blue over it, and you can start to see that it is a nice subtle effect, but it's not perhaps as overpowering as if we were to use an airbrush for it. Now, because the sword is there, it would also affect some other areas. So I have glazed blue on like the underside of the shoulder pad, the knee pad, some of the breastplate, and some of just the other areas. But we will also have it on the cape. Oh, I've also put it on that arm there, which I actually forgot to blend earlier on, so that's kind of saved me the trouble of having to go back with that. But it would hit the inside of the cape. Now, while we could just build up some layers of blue over the top of it, this will take a while. So rather than doing that, you did see me earlier just paint one layer on, and you can hopefully see that it makes barely any difference to it. So rather than just applying it with the pure blue, I take some white from my palette, thinned down quite a lot, and I start just drawing some lines over the area where I want the light to be. This is kind of like we did with the zenithal earlier, where we're using that for our glazes for the contrast. This is kind of like we're adding in some white so that it is the maximum brightness for where we want our glow to be. This is because otherwise we would be glazing a lighter colour over a darker colour, which is difficult to do and takes quite a lot of layers to even get an effect, whereas now we're glazing a lighter colour over a brighter colour, in which case then it just works with the light shining through it. You probably got that, I didn't need to explain that, but still, just in case. And you can see here that I've not been too careful with how I'm painting it on. I kind of wanted it to look sort of like it's a flame coming onto it. So I've made it still look a bit scratchy, almost as if it's still seeing the embers that are flying through the air. But then I just come in with some blue and glaze over the top. Now at this point, again, I was doing this all on a Discord call, and both myself and all the people that were on it with me, we couldn't decide as to how bright the glow should be. Some thought that it should be very, very bright indeed, others thought that it should be quite subtle. So in the end I ended up painting both ways and ended up with, I think, subtle worked better, and you'll see that towards the end of it. But I thought it better to show you the entire process of me painting it, just so that you can see how it goes in case you liked the way that it turned out. But then also to see sort of how to fix it if you do perhaps go a little bit over the top, as I think I did with the glow, in order to fix it like that. If it does go wrong, never assume that it is ruined. You can just paint over it again, you can glaze over it, and in fact I think it took 2 or 3 attempts to get this right, and it looks alright now, I think. But it could have gone wrong at many times, but there are very easy fixes for it. And the fix in this case is you'll see me here just glazing some of the dark plum over the area in order to blend it all out. This is why we didn't really highlight it earlier, because it would have meant highlighting it and glazing over a little bit trickier, not impossible, so if you do want to highlight it you can, but you may just have to do a couple of mixes in order to make sure it blends nicely. Now at this point I was thinking that, well, maybe I'd made the glow too bright, and so I needed to go. So I glazed all the way back down to a dark plum and blue mix, but then it seemed a bit too dark. So I added some white into the transparent blue again and started painting it on by hand into that area, just to make it more opaque, because I wondered if that might be the issue. This did look alright, and you could leave it here. It's still a bit bright for how I would have liked, but it could have worked and I think if the sword was closer to it, this would have worked quite nicely, but because it is off to the side, it's just a bit too bright. And you can see here that I've just returned with a bit more white onto the brush and I'm moving into the middle of that glow. Again, this was just because I thought that, well, maybe if I made it more opaque, it would look better. I think I still left this here, and that main dot into the middle of it is probably all that's left of the glow at this stage, which you'll see towards the end. But doing this did just help to make sure that I had that opaque dot, and it really, if anything, solidified how much I needed the glow to be there, but I didn't need it to be that bright, if that makes sense. and after adding some pure white and realising that's far too bright, I glazed over all of it with some dark plum and some more blue, and we arrive at this. You can also see that I've painted the brazier and I've painted the metal around it, as well as the gauntlet that was holding it, and now I'm just adding some more blue tinges over from the other direction. Now the flame in the brazier didn't come out quite as well as the flame on the sword. I suspect because when I was painting it, I was rushing it a little bit at this point, but also the flame, when you push it together, is in two halves, so they've had to make it so it is a bit more solid than the flames on the sword, because they're modelled on, whereas the brazier itself is two separate bits, so it's a bit chunkier. Again, this is probably the workmen blaming their tools, but that's just kind of how I found about it. But for this, all I'm doing is just adding in some more blue. Again, feathering it here. As I said, not very good at feathering, but it did seem to work in this regard. And I'm adding some subtle blue lights from that side with the brazier onto the gold, onto the side of the head, and just all the areas. I don't want it to be overpowering. I decided that I'd probably make it a colder blue that sort of, I think it's a bit in one of I think it's Realm Slayer, the Gotrek Gurneson one starring Brian Blessed, where Gotrek and the other one, Brodor I think his name was, are travelling through the realm of death, and they have this magical flame that doesn't give off much light or heat, but it does keep spirits away. And so I thought, well, since they're things to do with Mordor, maybe I'll have something like that. So it's not giving off too much light, it's more used as a weapon than a heat source or to light the way. Also to sort of add that symbolic meaning that it isn't a torch in order to be a guide for other Stormcast, it is purely used as a weapon at this point. If we go into the narrative side of it, we may not, could just think, well, it's a blue flame and I got a bit lazy. Either is good. just finishing off the final sort of layers of the OSL there. Tried to keep it, again, as I said, fairly subtle, but you can see that I am just putting it over some of the metallic areas. I actually found that the adding some transparent blue over the dark sea bend really works quite nicely, so I might incorporate that into some of the colour schemes later on. And it helps to blend some of the highlights, but it just adds a certain flavour to it, I suppose, that doesn't necessarily need to have the OSL to go with it. But now we get on to chapter 14, the final details. These final details are the tiny things, such as we have the cameo on the shoulder plate. It could be a tilting plate, I'm not sure. Again, you can tell that I've been playing Elden Ring because you get R'Lana's cameo just when you get to Castle Ensis, and I think I just got that when I was painting it. But I used a mixture of, I think this was a grey that I'd mixed up with black and white with a little bit more white into it, and a touch of the caramel brown, just to add some brown to it. That uses a base coat, and then I added more white into that mix to highlight it up to look like stone. Because it's such a tiny detail, I couldn't really get a good shot of it onto the camera, but hopefully you would see it. I do the same on the shoulder pad, but the flame continually gets in the way. You'll also notice that I've added some more white onto the flame in the brazier. I think this makes it work a bit more. It's still a little bit messy, so I may go back and just blend that out, but again, it would have added way more time, and this video would never have come out if I'd spent all of that now. But you can see I'm just adding some brighter highlights onto the area. This is very much the same. This is just very simple layering, so just look for any raised details that are perpendicular to your light source and highlight them accordingly. And you can see I'm just doing the shoulder pad, and once that is done, we have a nice bright thing. It's fairly subtle, but it does help to separate some of the details. And the only thing that we have left is the shield. Oh, I suppose I have the shield and the chain and the parchments and the base. So it's not the only thing we've got left, but it's the only major thing that we've got left. Now for painting the shield, I've chosen to speed the footage up after the base coat because it's roughly the same idea as we have with painting the majority of the metals anyway. It's just for the base coat rather than using the contrast paint. And this is entirely because I forgot you could use it for this, but it was just when I was painting I forgot to do it. I'm using a mixture of dark sea ben and black, thinned down and painted all over the area that I wanted the shield to be. The box art, I think, has it as a sort of a brassy or bronzy metallic shield. I didn't really like that, plus it would have meant painting even more gold onto it, and I thought that might detract from the freehand around the cape. So I chose to do it in a silver. And I've sped the footage up so you can still see it, and you can still see me place all of the highlights, because highlighting the shield has some interesting curves and shapes to it, which might be tricky for if it's your first time approaching it or if you're still new to painting this kind of thing. So hopefully you'll be able to see where I'm painting my highlights, but all I'm doing each time I increase the highlight is just adding in a little bit more white to it. And I do glaze in some areas afterwards, but I shall leave you with the speed up and you can watch that, and I'll chime in when we get to doing some reflections and stuff. those blue areas wasn't the best idea, so I thought I'll get some dark plum and I'll paint that into the shadows to look sort of like it's the shield reflecting the cape. And it works subtly, but I'm not sure I did it very well, and that probably this was my own mistake in trying to do it. I did highlight it eventually and show that there was some sort of brighter points coming through, but I think I need to work on that to sell the effect anymore. I did end up correcting it and glazing over it in order to sort some stuff out, and it kind of ruined the effect of it there, but it still now just looks like it's not getting as much light due to the parchment, so it still came out alright. If you want to have a go at this, I would suggest painting in when you do your shadows with dark sea bent mixed with some of the dark plum, so that it doesn't look like it's a colour hitting onto it. It is something that is working with the metal itself. This is something that I forgot to do, but I'll probably work on this and try it again on a different Stormcast in a future video, just so we can really get this done in case it's a technique that you want to try on yours. It's not to say that when it finished it looked bad, it just kind of looked a bit weird, I suppose. I just did some final steps of glazing just to balance everything, and probably glazing the wrong point, so I should probably go back and highlight stuff. But the next step is to just do the chain. So I base coated it in black and then just added white into black in order to build it up. Again, I've left this footage in. I probably could have skipped over it, you probably get the idea by now, but I've left it in just for another example of it because it's a little easier to see than some of the teeny tiny details we did earlier. But all it is a case of is just applying black as a base coat and adding touches of white to it for each of your subsequent layers. It looks different to the blue metallic that we've done before with the dark sea Ben, but not enough that it looks too out of place. It just looks like it's a slightly different form of metal, which I find kind of helps when you've got lots of metallic details onto it, just to have some done with different recipes in order to break it up, even if you don't want it to be necessarily a different style of metal. So cold versus warm, or gold versus silver, or iron, or bronze, or anything like that. I was also painting this while on a Discord call as well, so it does go off camera ever so slightly, but the only times that it does go off camera is probably because I'm either using the hairdryer for it or I got distracted because somebody was asking for something, so apologies for that. But if you want to be a part of the various calls that we do have on my server, feel free to sign up for my Patreon. It should give you access to Discord. It should, if Patreon is behaving itself. If it isn't, I will send you a link when I get the notification that you have joined via the Patreon messenger thingy, and then you can join. We have paint-alongs, we have regular voice calls in the evening where we'll just sit and talk about pretty much whatever comes into our minds. We've had a sort of 3-hour discussion about old horror films the other day, which is kind of fun. But yeah, if you want to be a part of that, I'd love to see you in there. If you can't afford it, do not worry. And if you want to join, that is excellent. If you don't have the facility to, that's absolutely fine. The fact that you're watching is more than payment enough. Other thing to notice just with the chain here is that as it floats, what goes around the body of the Stormcast, you will have to get your brush in between some of the areas that you've painted before, so just try to keep your wrists together in order to rest them so that you don't have, you have as much brush control as possible. See, I'm just adding some more white to that bit, and then we can move on to the little gold trinkets. Now this shows you how I build up the gold using my method of doing non-metallics rather than how Flameon does it again. It is on a teeny tiny surface, so it's a little tricky to see, but I will show you in another video how I do it. But it is just the same process as how I applied the metal for the shield, just with the gold paints as before and the same recipe. And it's just going from dark green brown up to caramel brown, up to bright yellow ochre, up to bright pale yellow. Once those are done, we don't need to blend them because they're small enough that the eye will interpolate it for us. Now we get on to the parchments. Now for the parchment, I did a mixture of black and caramel brown with a tiny touch of the dark pale yellow in. This was not intentional, it was just because the paint leaked onto my palette and I didn't notice until I'd added it to the paint, but it came out quite nicely. So you can get away with just using black and caramel brown, but you may want to add a little bit of the dark pale yellow if it's not perhaps as light for you. And I built up by just adding more and more of the bright pale yellow into the mix and a little touch of white here and there as well, building up all the subsequent highlights and using a sort of a volumetric method where you just leave some of the base coat into all of the areas that are not perpendicular to your light source and highlighting all of the others. This can look a bit sort of patchy in places, and you'll probably notice as it's going along that it does look patchy. It doesn't look great actually at times, but with a little bit of blending, and then as we're doing some freehand over it anyway, it does help to blend it all together. And I did the freehand just with pure black, thinned down so it's almost like the consistency of ink. You can do freehand or you may not wish to, so it's entirely down to you. Now that we have a solid foundation for our writing, we can start to add it in. I often find that when I'm doing any form of writing, be it the indication of it or indeed to do actual letters onto a miniature or a surface, I find it's best to keep the paint to be a consistency of ink, or generally 3 parts water to 1 part paint. As long as you've got some control over it, that's what you need, but you don't need it to be too thick. This makes it easier to paint over if you make a mistake. Now you'll notice in the video that I sometimes drag my brush from left to right, sometimes from right to left. This is simply to adapt to the way that the miniature is modelled. Sometimes it's easier to write as normal, other times it's easier to write backwards. You can also pepper your design with any number of strange esoteric symbols or checkerboards, as you can see that I'm painting here. If you want to have a go at a checkerboard effect, all you have to do is draw in your construction lines, trying to keep your hand as steady as possible, and then fill in those areas into black or whichever colour you are painting in. If you make a mistake, you can just go back and add in some of your previous base coat into the areas that you don't want to be the colour that you're adding in. I think this is left over from when John Blanche used to do the artwork for them, because he likes checkerboards, and adding them in is kind of a nice callback to that. I also at this point decided just to add a vague interpretation of a skull just onto one of them. Again, this is more me doodling at this stage. You don't have to follow these if you don't want to. You can just add some writing, or you could leave them blank if you prefer. With that, the Lord Veritant is finished, and all that is left to do is her base. There are some rocks modelled onto the miniature that attach to the foot and the cape, so do be sure to paint those before you add any further basing material. I used a mixture of dark umber, white and dark sea ben when doing mine, as they were on the palette at the time. After that, I chose to go for an autumnal theme for the base, and I added some scatter from Reality in Scale, as you can see here. A Reality in Scale is a company that I highly recommend. I then added some leaves from Gale Force 9 Scenics, although you can find them from most other reliable brands too. And it needed another texture, I wanted to avoid tufts for this base. I added a branch, also from Reality in Scale, and some small rocks. I blackened the base rim with satin black from Pro Acryl, and then applied a few coats of AK Ultra Matte varnish upon the whole miniature with the airbrush. If this was a display piece, I might not have varnished it, but as I intend to use my Stormcast for gaming, I thought a few layers couldn't hurt just to protect it a little further. I'm a little stuck on what to paint next though, so hopefully you viewers at home can help me decide for me. Should I paint the Lord Vigilant on Grittstalker, as seen in most of the box art of Skaventide, or the Lord Terminus with Memorion? This is the miniature that is seen for the art of the new core book for Age of Sigmar. Images of which I might put on screen if I remember, or you can find them on the Warhammer website, or whichever one just sounds cooler. Parts of the next videos will be shorter, as they'll be using the same techniques and palette as I have used in this video, and instead I'll focus on any new techniques, textures and styles that are unique to those miniatures and go into more detail. As a bonus, I'll put the unedited versions onto Patreon so you can see every brushstroke in agonising detail when I remember to keep it in frame. They'll be available here too, just as the edited and shrunk down version, so they won't all be 4 hours long. I do hope you've enjoyed this video, and apologies that there was such a wait between the last one and this one. I had a few work-related issues that I needed to deal with, and then I caught COVID, so I was out of commission for a bit. If you want to support the channel, as I've said, Patreon is an option, but if you can't afford it or simply just don't want to, that's totally fine, and the videos will still be made. If you follow this tutorial, feel free to tag me on Instagram if you use it, as I'd love to see any scheme that you interpret. Anyway, that's enough from me, and I'll see you in the next one.